Chapter 330. Dean was overjoyed as he saw this scene. He couldn't wait to load another shark spear to chase after the splitter. But he calmly restrained himself. If he continued to fire, the barrel was likely to burst. Nicholas, who was next to the battery, looked at the splitter thousands of meters away from the giant wall. His eyes were full of shock. He didn't expect that such a terrifying giant monster would be so embarrassed in front of this boy. Although he didn't know much about monsters, but he knew that such a giant monster's hunting level was absolutely extraordinary. Otherwise, people like Dean, who was close to a senior hunter's physique, wouldn't be so cumbersome to prepare a lot of items and carefully rely on such a natural terrain advantage to attack. What shocked him even more was that Dean had assembled such a terrifying weapon. Coupled with the tungsten steel spear, its destructive power was simply terrifying. He couldn't help but think that if such a weapon was installed on every fortress inside the giant wall, then how could the barbarians dare to invade? However, in addition to the weapon, what made him feel the most was Dean himself. He had never seen such a terrible person, not to mention that the latter was just a young boy. Previously, he clearly saw that when Dean was loading the shark spear, he deliberately adjusted the angle of the metal cylinder on the shark spear. At that time, he had some doubts. But when he saw the shark spear being shot, he realized that it was Dean's masterpiece. Insidious prediction and calculation. In just a few seconds, his perception of Dean had once again undergone earth-shaking changes. Before, he thought that Dean was a mature and talented architect. For this age, he was a rare character. But at this moment, no matter how he looked at Dean, he felt that the latter was like a devil in human clothes. This terrible calculation and coldness, as well as the extraordinary wisdom to forge terrible weapons, were by no means possessed by human beings. In the pair of calm eyes, there seemed to be a deep evil aura overlooking everything. He couldn't help but feel regret in his heart. He shouldn't have exposed his ambition too early and offended such a monster. At this moment, looking at the ferocious giant beast that was 1,000 meters away and struggling with its whole body wrapped in chains, his heart felt cold and his limbs went cold. He stared blankly and was speechless. "Give me the bow." Dean's voice brought Nicotine back to reality. Nicotine's hair stood up as he heard Dudian's words. He instinctively reacted quickly as he looked around and found the bow and arrows that Dudian had brought. He went forward and picked them up. Dudian wanted the bow. Was he going to? He turned and trotted quickly, handing the bow and arrows to Dean. Dean grabbed the bow and arrow, but didn't look at him. His eyes were firmly locked on the splitter. He saw the splitter desperately struggle and finally cut off one of the chains. Its body regained some mobility and quickly ran away. However, its speed wasn't as fast as it came. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly. Holding the bow, he took a step forward and stood on the edge of the giant wall. Facing the cold wind, his clothes fluttered in the wind. Nicholas was scared as he saw Dean's bold move. The wind at the height of a kilometer was extremely fierce. A little bit of carelessness, and he would be swept down. Even a person with a high physique would find it difficult to resist. Dean wasn't nervous. Instead, he slowly opened his arms and held the bow in one hand, as if to embrace the wind. He was indeed embracing the wind. His body slowly leaned forward, and then he suddenly leaped. Whoosh! Dean's body quickly fell down. Nicotine's heart almost jumped out of his throat. He couldn't help but scream. He didn't think that Dean would commit suicide. He rushed to the edge and stretched his head to look down. He saw that Dean's body had shifted to the front. The bow in his hand was relatively heavy. His jumping posture quickly changed to head down and feet up. Nicotine's mind went blank. A moment ago he was afraid of Dean, but now he was committing suicide in such a way. He couldn't figure it out, but it was the truth. Dean, who was falling about 100 meters down, suddenly had a semicircular cloth appear under his armpits. His falling speed was greatly reduced, and he was gliding forward. If people from the old era saw this scene, they would be extremely familiar with it. This was the gliding equipment of extreme sports. But at the moment, Dean was using it to hunt monsters. Nicotine's eyes almost popped out of their sockets as he stared at the scene in front of him. A person was flying? Whoosh! Dean opened his arms. He was a little nervous. This was his first flight test. It was the first time he used it in actual combat. Moreover, he was facing a legendary monster that had reached level 68. He admired his courage. At this moment, his ears were filled with the whistling of the wind. His arms swayed slightly, adjusting the angle of his glide. After gliding for 200 to 300 meters, he grasped a bit of the wind and was able to control the angle of his glide a bit more. Looking at the wilderness and the great earth below him, all of the blood in his body sped up. This intense stimulation caused his hormones to soar and his blood to boil. After gliding to 500 meters above the ground, he tried to adjust the angle to follow behind the splitter. Although the gliding speed was extremely fast, the splitter's running speed was even faster. Previously, when he was on the giant wall, he didn't have a strong feeling, but the closer he got, the more he felt the amazing speed of the splitter. Moreover, it was injured. Boom, boom. The splitter quickly ran forward. Along the way, the weeds were cut by the giant's sword. The distance between the splitter and Dean was quickly pulled apart. In the blink of an eye, the splitter had run to a place where Dean needed to look up to see it. By the time it reached a height of more than 200 meters, the splitter had run away and was about to disappear at the end of his line of sight. Dean didn't continue to look at the splitter. He touched the small backpack on his back. He had worn this backpack when he was climbing. At this moment, the backpack was pulled open and a fluffy cloth suddenly flew out. It was a parachute. This was the backpack that Dean had prepared for himself when he was climbing. In case he accidentally fell, it could save his life. After the parachute opened, Dean slowly descended to the ground. After landing, he rolled over and quickly untied the backpack. He held the bow in one hand and the quiver in the other. He quickly chased after the splitter. The real hunt had now begun. Chapter 331. Whoosh. Dean was nervous as he followed the trampled ground. After all, the splitter could smell his scent. It could turn around and kill him at any time. It would be absolutely difficult for him to escape on land. However, he had the courage to come down and track the splitter because of another consideration. For the splitter, he was just a small character. Moreover, the unknown enemy was in the direction of the giant wall, so the probability of it turning back was very low. Dean didn't need to worry about encountering other monsters as he chased after the splitter. After all, the movement caused by the splitter was too strong. As the hegemon of this generation, the monsters should have formed a fear reaction when they smelled the splitter's scent. Dean didn't encounter other monsters after chasing for more than 30 kilometers. He thought that the splitter had been in front of the giant wall several times. The monsters of this generation should have been treated as snacks by it. Dean gradually reduced his speed after chasing for more than 10 kilometers. He took out the undead powder and sprinkled it on his body. Although the splitter wasn't picky about the meat species, but the main purpose of the undead powder was not to cover his human scent, but to cover his own scent. He didn't want the splitter to detect that the smell on his body was the same as the one it smelled in front of the giant wall. Dean stealthily touched the ruins of a high-rise building. It was a 4-story residential building that had cracked and crumbled. The tiles on the wall had long fallen off and were covered with green hairy moss. He immediately smelled the smell of blood-sucking rats, the smell of decaying corpses, and the smell of decaying corpses. However, this smell of decay was different from the smell of decaying corpses. It belonged to the smell of decaying corpses that had died. The subtle difference could only be distinguished by experience. Dean quickly climbed to the top of the residential building. He stepped on the wall and almost lost his balance and fell down. Dean instinctively bent down and looked into the distance. He saw a figure more than 30 meters high. It was crawling in the middle of a ruined street. The surrounding buildings had long collapsed and were buried in vines and weeds. Splitter was lying on the ground, gasping for breath. Its body was tangled by the tungsten steel chains. Green liquid and blood kept seeping out from the places where the shark spears were pierced. Dean's eyes flashed. He didn't expect the splitter to be so tenacious. Only he knew the real killer move of the tungsten steel shark spear. It wasn't its destructive power, but the large amount of venom inside the shark spear. Dean bought 3 different kinds of poisons from the temple during the days when he was making the turrets. They were the most poisonous drugs that had been researched by wood architects. He bought 100 pounds of each type of poison every day. In a few days, he bought more than 1,000 pounds of poison. If it weren't for the fact that the antidotes for these poisons had already been developed and that they weren't instant poisons, the sale of these poisons would have been banned in the temple long ago. Dean specially forged 6 shark spears that were loaded with poison. The tip of each shark spear was filled with mercury. Behind the mercury was a thin layer of metal. The body of the shark spear was filled with poison. The reason behind a shark spear was the same as his mercury arrows. They were made using the explosive method of the old era. When a shark spear pierced into Splitter's body, the highly dense mercury inside the spear's tip would instantly break through the spear's tip and pour into Splitter's body. Once the mercury broke through the hole, the poison inside the spear would also flow out and seep into Splitter's body. If the poison directly poured into some important body parts, it would have an unexpected effect. After all, these poisons were all top-notch poisons that he had never banned from selling. Some were in the form of powder, and some were in the form of liquid. No matter what kind of poison it was, a sesame-sized one would be able to poison an ordinary adult strongman. If the poison wasn't treated for a long time, it would certainly be fatal. If it was directly injected into the blood vessels, then even if it was a slow poison, it would instantly take a person's life. However, at the moment the Splitter was attacked by 3 shark spears. The shark spears had pierced into its body, but it still had some strength left. The tenacity of its vitality was really terrifying. Is it because the mercury didn't penetrate the spear tip and the venom didn't pour into its body? Dean couldn't help but doubt. He silently calculated the time when the 3 poisons would take effect. He wanted to use these poisons to exhaust the Splitter to death. If he couldn't exhaust the Splitter to death, then he would have to run away. As for hunting, unless the Splitter was on the verge of death and couldn't move. Otherwise, he would never take the risk of using his arrows to tickle the Splitter's carapace. The main purpose of bringing the bow and arrows was to guard against other monsters. Dean was a little glad that Splitter's body structure showed that it belonged to the extreme attack-type monster. All of its limbs were sharp blades, which caused its defense to be far inferior to other monsters of the same level. If it was like the guardian of the 8 legendary monsters, then he would have to give up. It was estimated that even if he made a tank or cannon, it would be difficult to hurt that monster. Time ticked by. The Splitter was lying on the ground to rest. It seemed that it was unwilling to move. Dean looked at it from afar. He wasn't sure if it was tired and resting or if it was exhausted by the venom. After waiting for a long time, he couldn't help but want to pull the bow and shoot to see its reaction. But in the end, he held back. If the Splitter was just resting, then his action would undoubtedly be courting death. He could only continue to wait and observe. This was a problem that most hunters would encounter during hunting, and he had to solve it. The time for the 3 poisons to take effect in the human body is 4 hours, 10 hours, and 18 hours respectively. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. Its physique is completely different from that of a human. Humans' poison time is completely useless. Father said that if we use mismatched data as a reference, the result will inevitably be a failure. I have to test it, but I can't use the bow and arrows. He thought for a moment, and suddenly remembered that there was still a small cluster of Splitter's blood powder in his armor. His eyes suddenly lit up. He turned around and returned to the residential building. In the absence of electricity, the building was dark even in broad daylight. The windows were covered by thick vines and dust. Dean's eyes quickly swept over and quickly followed the smell. He found several active blood-sucking rats in a hole in the corner. Whoosh! He quickly jumped over and grabbed a blood-sucking rat. He pinched its neck so that it couldn't bite his wrist. After the blood-sucking rat was caught, its companions were scared and immediately shrank back into the hole. They ran straight to the next floor. Dean didn't pay attention to the other blood-sucking rats. He grabbed the squeaky rat and went back to the roof. He took out the rest of the blood powder and tied it to the neck of the rat. The blood powder was wrapped around the back of the rat's neck to prevent it from being torn off by its claws. The rat squeaked anxiously. It seemed that it was afraid of the smell of the undead on Dean's body. Dean pinched its body and threw it to the splitter in front of him. At the moment, he was 2 or 3 kilometers away from the splitter. The rat was thrown about 700 or 800 meters away and fell into the grass. Chapter 332. Squeak. The blood-devouring rat fell into the grass, which was denser than its surroundings. The blood-devouring rat rolled 7 or 8 times after falling into the grass, but did not die on the spot. It grimaced in pain as it screamed and rolled its body, trying to get up. However, one of its legs was broken, and it could not stand firm even after trying several times. In the end, it could only crawl on the ground and slowly drag its body towards a patch of grass to the side. Dean shrank his body to the edge of the bungalow. He only revealed a pair of eyes as he stared at Splitter. He didn't care whether the rat was dead or alive. Whether it was dead or alive, Splitter wouldn't care about the ability of this little thing. The real test for Splitter was the blood powder on the back of the rat. There was only the sound of the breeze. Dean held his breath as time passed. In the blink of an eye, 7 or 8 seconds had passed. Splitter heard the sound of the rat falling into the bungalow. There was no movement after that. Dean's heartbeat gradually accelerated. He didn't see any movement from Splitter after 10 seconds. His heart was relieved. His eyes flashed with killing intent. He quickly opened the quiver on his back and pulled out an arrow. He jumped down the bungalow and jumped into the desolate street. Thick weeds grew in the cracks of the street to cover his body. I have to hit its flaws. Dean was approaching at full speed. This was the most dangerous moment. He would personally give a monster a final fatal blow. Moreover, he only had one chance to make a move. Dean was also observing Splitter when he secretly delivered food to the small Splitter. After all, it was a legendary monster. Whether it was the Temple of Elements or the forces of the inner wall, it was a precious opportunity to observe a legendary monster at such a close distance. Dean roughly understood the structure of Splitter's body and observed its 2 weaknesses. The first one was the eyeball. For most creatures, the eyeball was the weakest part. This was no exception for Splitter. However, the eyelid on the outside of its eyeball was a sturdy protective layer. It was one of the rare creatures that had evolved their eyelids into armor. Moreover, the thickness of the armor was 3 centimeters. Even an ordinary handgun bullet would only be able to leave a dent on the surface of the armor. Therefore, the only way to hit the eyeball was to grab the moment before the eyelid closed. The second weakness was its excretion. Out of all the limbs on its body, more than 80% were scythe-like arms, and the remaining 20% were the head and the torso. This was an extremely shocking ratio. Its torso was flat, and its surface was covered by a layer of hard carapace. The edges were extremely sharp, and if it were a human's body, even the waist would be as sharp as a blade and could be used to attack enemies. But the excretion at the tail was an unprotected place. Although the excretion was covered by the carapace, there was no other extra protection. As long as an arrow was shot into it, it could cause damage. Whoosh! Dean ran through the grass and circled behind the Splitter. Previously, he had used the blood powder as bait, but it didn't move. This made him feel a little relieved as he got close to the range. It didn't take long for Dean to reach the position of 150 meters away from Splitter. This was his effective range. His maximum effective range had already reached 300 meters. However, his destructive power was at its peak at 150 meters. Moreover, the accuracy was also the highest. Dean bent down in the grass, looking at the 30-meter tall giant in front of him. If the latter counterattacked, he would die. He could not help but feel nervous. His whole body was tense, his muscles were tense, and he did not dare to breathe. Dean moved a few steps to the left and right to adjust the angle. From here, he could see that the tail of the Splitter was hanging on the ground. There were messy, side-like arms on both sides of the torso. There were several attack angles from which he could shoot the tail of the Splitter in a straight line. He picked the best angle and put an arrow on it. He didn't dare to reveal too much killing intent. He treated the Splitter as a target for his training in the past. He restrained his murderous intent. Only one arrow. Dean narrowed his eyes. He slowly took a deep breath and locked his eyes on the excretion. Whoosh! The arrow flew away. Dean didn't foolishly stand in the same place to see the result. Instead, he turned around and ran. The distance of 150 meters was crossed in the blink of an eye. The arrowhead penetrated into Splitter's excretory orifice. Splitter was lying motionless on the ground. It growled as its huge body slowly moved. It turned its head and saw Dean rushing through the grass. It roared and chased after him. Dean's face changed. He didn't expect it to have such a powerful physical strength. He quickly shot an arrow at a tall building in the distance. There was a rope tied to the back of the arrow. He dragged the rope and swung to the back of the tall building. He turned around and continued to run. Bang! The body of Splitter crashed into the tall building. Dean didn't run in a straight line. He jumped into a gap not far away. It must be known that this place used to be a city. There were dark sewers and subways under the ground. Dean jumped straight into the gap. After the high-temperature radiation of the Black Death season, the water had long dried up. It was a subway station. Dean was not surprised. He had seen a roadside sign covered with moss and dust in the grass. Although the writing on it was blurred, there were still some traces left, so he recognized it. He looked up and saw a black steel dragon in the distance. It was the subway. Dean was not surprised to see the subway stop at the platform. He immediately ran towards it. Before he attacked Splitter, he had perceived the surrounding environment. The smell of decay was very strong. It was obvious that there was a subway stop at the platform. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a strong smell of decay. Bang! Dean went into the subway through the window. The subway was dark. There were 2 rows of seats with corpses lying on the ground. Most of them were bones covered with thick dust. The flesh and blood had long decayed over the years. There were also some dried corpses lying on the ground. Their skin was wrinkled. They looked like 80-years-old people. There were patches of brown spots on their skin. Their cheeks and clothes looked like those of young people in their 20s. Dean's eyes turned cold as he saw the corpses. He didn't go near them. He ignored them and ran straight to the subway. The corpses suddenly opened their eyes and reached out to grab Dean as Dean passed by. But Dean's speed was too fast, so they caught nothing. The next moment, all the corpses stood up one by one like evil spirits. Their wrinkled faces were incomparably ferocious as they growled and chased after Dean. Dean saw that these guys were alarmed. He sighed in his heart. Although he had smeared the undead powder, but he was too nervous when he was attacking Splitter. His sweat had caused his smell to overshadow the smell of the undead powder, so he couldn't fool them. The Monster Atlas says that the undead are afraid of fire and will follow the light. When it is dark, they will follow the sound. When it is silent, the undead will sleep. Dudian ran all the way and found that there were 7 or 8 undead sleeping in each subway carriage. Due to the lack of light and food for a long time, their skin was shriveled and they were seriously dehydrated. With the appearance of Dean, all the undeads sleeping in the subway woke up and roared as they chased after Dean. Dean took out the undead powder and continued to smear it on his body. Rumble. Outside the subway, a loud noise could be heard. It was Splitter. Its huge body squeezed into the subway through the gap. Bang! Dean felt the subway under his feet slightly vibrate. He could not help but be aghast. He could only hear a harsh creaking sound coming from behind. It was like nails scratching a metal plate. It was a sharp friction sound. Dean couldn't help but think that Splitter wouldn't cut off the subway, right? With the sharpness of the latter's scythe arm, it wouldn't be difficult to cut off the subway. Dean didn't dare to stop and continued to run. Some of the revived undead roared and rushed towards Splitter after smelling the smell of Splitter. Some were still chasing behind Dean. These undead were fearless. Soon more than a dozen undead gathered in front of Splitter. They bared their fangs and brandished their claws at the behemoth. Splitter roared and waved its sharp blade to cut off the undead that were running towards it. However, some of the undead that weren't beheaded were still crawling towards Splitter. Splitter didn't pay attention to these little guys. It waved its scythe arm and cut the subway into several pieces. It roared twice, but didn't continue to move forward. It just crawled on the ground. A large number of undead ran out of the subway. They smelled the blood flowing out of Splitter's body. They were like sharks that smelled fish. They were excited and rushed toward Splitter. The two slender scythe arms on the back of Splitter gently moved and easily pushed away the undead that were rushing towards it. The body of the undead was cut into two pieces. Dean ran along the subway all the way to the other end of the cab. He kicked the door open and saw three corpses lying on the ground in the cab. They had accumulated a thick layer of dust. The flesh and blood had decayed and disappeared, leaving only black skeletons. There was a figure wearing a military cap sitting on the seat of the subway. Dean walked over to the driver's seat. The figure slowly turned the seat and looked back. It was a shriveled face. The other half of the face seemed to have been bitten off by something, exposing teeth and cheekbones. Dean didn't look at it. The dagger in his hand quickly pierced through its head before it got up and rushed towards him. He didn't have time to take the cold crystal from its head. He kicked open the front window of the driver's seat and jumped out of the subway. He ran to another platform and looked back. He was relieved to see that Splitter didn't chase after him. It's difficult to kill it even if I hit its weakness with my bow and arrow. Dean frowned as he thought about other hunting methods. Roar. At this time, the undead that were chasing after Dean rushed out from the broken front window. They didn't know how to jump, so their posture when they landed was much uglier. Almost all of them slid down the front of the subway. They climbed up after they landed and climbed towards the platform where Dean was standing. Dean lifted his foot and kicked. Bang! An undead with curly hair and fashionable clothes with a ferocious face was kicked by Dean. The front of the hunter's boots was made of alloy, which was extremely hard. With Dean's strength, the undead's throat was broken. The undead's chin was attached to Dean's shoes. Bang! Dean's toes slightly hooked, and the undead's head was dislocated from the cervical vertebra and flew out. Dean continued to kick the other two undead to death. He turned around and ran to the other side of the subway. He didn't want to continue to entangle with these undead. Dean frowned as he looked around at the desolate open space. He had used almost all the methods he could think of to hunt the monsters. The only thing he could use was the old method, which was to lure other monsters to attack the Splitter. However, Splitter was different from the usual monsters. Even if it was an injured monster, its level 68 hunting rank was far higher than any other monster in the area. Even the strongest monster in the area could be easily killed by Splitter. With his physique, he could only lure a level 20 monster at most. Even if a monster like that ran in front of Splitter, it would be scared and run away in a panic. No matter what, I can only try. Maybe I can lure a few bold ones. Dean thought about it and finally decided to use the old method. Whoosh! He turned around and ran in the direction of a scent that was more than 10 miles away from where his sense of smell had picked up. In the blink of an eye, he arrived in front of the smell. It was a black figure that was nearly 4 meters tall. Its whole body was covered with sharp hair. It looked like a giant wild boar. There were 6 or 7 curved, white tusks in front of its protruding mouth. Snow-tooth monster pig, level 24. Dean immediately recognized the information of this monster. This was one of the more popular monsters among the nobles. The tusks on its body were the favorite collection materials of the nobles. Many noble families had carvings of the snow-tooth monster pig's teeth. Its speed should be faster than me. I can only take the risk. Dean took a deep breath and shot an arrow from more than 600 meters away. The arrow fell halfway, but the movement was sensed by the snow-toothed pig. It saw Dean, who was 600 meters away, waving at it. A fierce look appeared in its eyes, and it roared as it rushed over. Dean immediately turned around and ran. Rumble! The snow-tooth monster pig was like a tank. The ground shook as it ran. When Dean looked back, he found that the speed of the two was rapidly closing. He couldn't help but jump in fright. He hurriedly turned around and ran. However, right when he was dashing with all his might, he suddenly heard a shrill and miserable cry from behind him, and it was followed by a loud bang. He couldn't help but turn around to look, and he saw that the snow-toothed devil pig had actually fallen to the ground. Its body rolled a few times, and it was groaning in pain as it couldn't get up. Dean was stunned. At this moment, he suddenly saw a purple shadow in the wilderness behind the snow-tooth monster pig. It looked like a human. Chapter 333. Dean was slightly stunned as he looked at them. The girl's skin was snow white, and her soft, jet-black hair complemented her fair skin. The purple tang robe she was wearing was engraved with images of some ferocious monsters, full of noble and unique charm. But the most eye-catching thing was the jet-black sword hilt that was nearly half a meter long, protruding from her shoulder. At the end of the hilt hung a perfectly round jewel that resembled an emerald. If one looked closely, one would find that there was a jet-black circle in the middle of the jewel that looked like an eyeball. Dean stared at her in a daze. The girl's body was light, but every step she took seemed to cross more than 10 meters. In the blink of an eye, she appeared 2 or 3 meters away from Dean. She looked up and down at Dean and said, "Little devil, are you a hunter?" Her voice was pleasant to hear, but the tone of her voice was old and inexperienced. Dean came back to his senses. There was some surprise in his heart. Judging from the accent, the girl should also be from the giant wall of Sylvia. But the accent was northern. He immediately said, "I'm a hunter from the New World Consortium. Are you from the Huashan Consortium or the Green Consortium?" These two consortia were based in the northern region. The girl slightly nodded, but did not directly answer Dean's question. Instead, she said, "You have been hunting in the vicinity for some time. Have you heard any huge movements or footprints of giant beasts?" Dean was startled. He shook his head. "I just came out to hunt today. I haven't seen any giant beasts. Is there a large monster in the vicinity?" There was a bit of tension on his face. The girl slightly stared at him and indifferently said, "Don't pretend. Your expression has betrayed you. You're young, but you have a lot of thoughts. But blind greed will eventually lead to death. This monster isn't something that your small consortia can eat. I don't care if you know or not, but I will tell you that this is one of the legendary monsters called Splitter. Its hunting level is as high as 68. Even if all the senior hunters of your consortia come out, they won't be enough to fill the gap between its teeth. What's more, I just saved your life. You'd better tell me the truth. If you don't, I'll destroy you and your consortium." Dean's face slightly changed. He didn't expect that the girl who was the same age as him would have such a keen observation ability. Moreover, the monster that the girl was looking for was really Splitter. Moreover, the girl knew all the information about Splitter. Despite this, she still dared to look for Splitter? Wasn't this courting death? Did she come here to inquire about the information? Dean's eyes lit up. "Even if you didn't attack me, I would still be able to save my life. But I will remember your kindness. As for Splitter, it is in the vicinity. As you said, it is a legendary monster that has reached level 68. I advise you not to get close and leave as soon as possible. It is very dangerous here." The girl in the tang suit heard Dean's words, but she seemed to be relieved and said to herself, "It seems that I have found the right place." She looked up and grabbed Dean's shoulder. "Tell me, where is it? Or where did you see its footprints?" Dean showed a sincere look. "You should go back. Even if you find it, it is moving around and has no fixed residence. Maybe tomorrow it will go out into the wilderness. I don't like to ask twice. Are you going to tell me or not?" The girl's face turned cold as a trace of coldness flashed in her eyes. Dean saw her expression and suddenly felt a sense of danger. His whole body was slightly cold. He was shocked in his heart. This girl's strength was a lot higher than his own. She was even stronger than Glenn. She should be at the top of the senior hunter level. She was able to defeat the level 24 snow-toothed boar from far away to prove this point. "All right, I will take you there." Dean immediately gave in. There was no law and order outside the giant wall. If he was killed, he would be killed. There was no way to pursue it. If his skill was not as good as others, he could only admit defeat. "Humph!" The girl snorted and pushed away Dean's body. "Hurry up. If it runs away, you will be ready to sacrifice to my blood vessel." Dean smiled slightly. Although he didn't know what the blood vessel was, he could understand the word sacrifice. He immediately turned around and went back to the original road. He didn't dare to play tricks before he could figure out the magic mark of the girl in the tang suit. He didn't want to anger her and lose his life. It didn't take long for Dean and the girl to return to the subway station. The ground was full of huge footprints and traces of crushed limbs left by the Splitter. The girl's face slightly changed as she saw the traces of destruction caused by the Splitter. She slowly raised her hand and grabbed the huge hilt on her back. The length of the hilt was about 50 centimeters. Under the hilt was a huge sword that was as wide as a door. The whole body was blood red. The edge of the huge sword had a diagonal groove, like a shark fin. Such a structural design would completely destroy the flesh and blood of the monster. The entire blood-red sword was nearly 3 meters tall, and the width of the blade was almost the same as the width of the girl's delicate body. From the back, it looked like a blood-red sword was walking on its own. Dean was careful to get information from the girl as he led the way. The girl's character seemed to be more casual. She answered most of the questions casually. Dean knew that the blood vessel she had mentioned before was this blood-red sword. "All right, I found its footprints. You can get out of here." The girl was elegant and noble, but there was not the slightest bit of politeness in her words. Dean was speechless. There was a trace of gloominess on his face. "It should not be far from here. You'd better leave here immediately." Long-winded, the girl quickly followed the direction of the footprints without looking back. Her hand was on the hilt of the sword. It seemed that she was ready to deal with any attack from the surroundings. Dean looked at the girl's posture. It seemed that she was going to hunt the splitter. He was startled. His eyelids twitched as he quickly followed the girl. The girl in the Tang suit seemed to have heard some movements and rushed straight to the subway entrance where the road had collapsed. She stopped abruptly in front of the gap like a javelin. Such an abrupt braking surprised Dean, who was chasing after her. Previously, he saw that the girl was running faster than him at full speed. How could she stop just like that? It could only mean that the girl's previous speed was very slow for her. It was like a trot for an ordinary person. Only in this way could she stop at the same time. The girl looked down from the gap. There was a touch of smile on her face. "Finally found you." While talking, he heard the sound coming from behind. He glanced at Dean, who was chasing behind him, and the smile in his eyes suddenly turned cold. Reckless. She retracted her gaze and ignored Dean. She was not in the mood to care about the safety of others in front of the enemy. Whoosh! She held the hilt of the sword and jumped down. After landing on the ground, she suddenly saw a huge figure crawling on the ground in front of her. There were some corpses gathering around the figure and crawling toward Splitter. Some corpses that had been cut into 2 pieces were still crawling toward Splitter, and then they were cut into 2 halves again. The girl was startled when she saw the appearance of the Splitter. There was a trace of doubt in her eyes. She looked at the body of the Splitter. She saw that there were black chains wrapped around the body of the Splitter. The chains were obviously artificially made. There was a giant spear-like weapon piercing its body. Seeing this scene, her eyes were filled with shock. Could it be that someone else had hunted this evil beast before? Roar! Splitter seemed to have sensed a trace of danger. Its body, which was lying on the ground, moved slightly and moved its body with difficulty. It overturned and crushed the nearby subway car and looked down at the girl in the Tang suit in front of it. From this small figure, it felt a trace of fear, so it let out a threatening roar, which was vigorous and deep, full of anger. The girl calmed herself down and took a deep breath. She stared at Splitter with her pitch-black eyes and dashed towards him. Dean, who was crawling in the hole, secretly watched the girl's action. At the moment, he saw her directly rush towards the Splitter. He couldn't help but be shocked. Is she crazy? She knew that the Splitter was a level 68 monster. How could she dare to attack it head-on? The Splitter looked at the girl in the Tang suit. It roared in anger. The scythe blades on its body slashed out. It didn't underestimate the girl. It seemed that it was treating her as a dangerous enemy. Chapter 334. Whoosh! The girl in the Tang suit jumped up. The bandage slowly fell off. The gray and dirty bandage wrapped around the blood-barren sword on her back suddenly disintegrated. The dark red sword released a demonic luster like a bloodthirsty beast. It flashed with a red light of excitement. The girl in the Tang suit wielded the sword like a blood-red crescent moon. She fiercely chopped the Splitter's body. Splitter screamed and waved its other 2 scythe-like arms. The width of these 2 scythe-like arms was more than double that of the other scythe-like arms. Although they looked like attacking limbs, they were used for defense. They were like two huge doors that blocked the front part of its body. The two scythe-like arms collided with the bloody sword in the hands of the girl in the Tang suit. Boom! A huge pit suddenly appeared on the ground. Splitter's huge body sank into the huge pit. The place where Blood Baron collided with the black scythe arm created a strong airflow, sweeping away the rancid smell in the air. However, it also swept up the dust on the ground. Dean, who was lying on the ground, was shocked. He saw that the girl in the Tang suit had used her toes to borrow the strength of the scythe-like arms. She flipped back and retreated. But when she flipped 180 degrees, she stepped on the inside of the other scythe-like arms. Once again, she used the strength of the scythe-like arms to attack Splitter at full speed. Bang! Splitter's body shook. The scythe-like arms that had been cut by the bloody sword burst open. Blood and green fluid sputtered out. The girl in the Tang suit pulled her wrist. The bloody sword cut through the wound like a sawtooth. Blood quickly sputtered out. Splitter issued a sharp roar. It waved its scythe-like arms to flank the other scythe-like arms. However, the girl's movements were incomparably fast. After the first strike landed, she quickly stepped on Splitter's scythe-like arm and circled around to the other side of its body. With a swing of her arm, the Blood Baron's greatsword was like a blood-colored whirlwind blade as it fiercely chopped at another part of Splitter's body. This time, it directly chopped at a joint, instantly chopping off one of Splitter's scythe-like arms that were swinging back to attack. All of this happened in a flash. The girl in the Tang suit was so fast that she was like a purple afterimage. She moved quickly on the body of Splitter. She used the tungsten steel chain that was wrapped around Splitter's body as a foothold. She constantly waved the bloody sword and cut off the scythe-like arms. Dean was dumbfounded. Is this the power of a human? Boom! The girl in the Tang suit went to the back of Splitter. Dean couldn't see where she was. Splitter's body trembled and issued a painful scream. The next moment, the scythe-like arms softened. A large amount of blood and green mucus was spat out from the middle of its body. Whoosh! The girl in the Tang suit flipped back and landed more than 10 meters away from Splitter. She was holding the bloody sword in her hand. The bloody sword looked like a beast that had drunk its fill of blood. The battle was over in just 10 seconds or so. Splitter was defeated. Dean looked at the girl who was more than 10 meters away from the Splitter. Her chest was heaving up and down violently. He had forgotten to hide his emotions. He was shocked and couldn't speak for a long time. He had expected all kinds of results. He even guessed that the girl in the Tang suit had extraordinary strength. But he never thought that the strength she possessed would be so terrifying. It was simply beyond the scope of human. Could it be that this was the level that humans could evolve to? Is this the existence of a senior hunter? The girl in the Tang suit gasped for a moment. She gradually recovered some of her physical strength. Although the battle was short, but the consumption was huge. She looked at the dying Splitter. She held the bloody sword and once again rushed forward. Bang! Bang! Splitter was unable to resist and was immediately beheaded by her sword. A legendary monster that was rarely seen in 100 years had died. Dean witnessed the whole process. He never thought that the girl with snow-white skin and a beautiful and delicate appearance would have such strength like a monster. His heart was pounding. The first thing that came to his mind was that he would be killed. He secretly regretted it. If he knew that this would happen, he wouldn't have continued to follow. It was obviously too late to escape. With the speed of the girl in the Tang suit, she could easily catch up with him. His face was ugly. At this moment, not to mention getting the magic mark of Splitter, he might even lose his small life. The girl in the Tang suit inserted the bloody sword into one of the wounds on Splitter's body. She put her hands on the hilt of the bloody sword and gasped for breath. If it wasn't for the fact that she was wearing a Tang suit, she would have directly sat on the big guy and rested. After resting for a while, she lifted up the Chong Sam skirt by her thighs, revealing a wilderness waist bag tied to her snow-white and slender legs. She opened the waist bag and took out a small red bottle. She uncorked the bottle and sprinkled some red powder on the wound pierced by the Blood Baron's greatsword. After pouring the red powder, the girl in the Tang suit took out a metal cylinder that was as thick as a wrist. It occupied more than half of the interior area of the bag. She opened the metal cylinder and quietly waited. Soon, a black object slowly wriggled up the blade of the blood-bearing greatsword. It was a jet-black insect, as thick as a finger. Dean's eyes turned red. There was no doubt that this was the Splitter's parasitic soul worm that he had spent a lot of effort to get. Compared with the parasitic soul worms he had seen before, this one was more than 10 times thicker. Ordinary parasitic soul worms were as thin as blood vessels, but this one was like an adult leech, fat and big. The girl in the Tang suit stretched out 2 fingers and pinched the bloody sword with lightning speed. She threw it into the metal cylinder, closed the lid, and tightened it. She put it into the waste bag and pulled out the bloody sword. She turned her head and glanced at Dean, who was above the gap, and hooked her finger at him. Dean's eyes quickly moved away from her waste bag. He stared at her expression for a moment. Seeing that she didn't seem to have any killing intent, he was a little relieved. He carefully jumped down from the gap and said, "I have a way to make you believe that I won't say anything." The girl in the Tang suit saw Dean's trembling and cautious appearance. She giggled and ridiculed him. "Really? But I only know that the dead won't say anything." Dean saw her expression and faintly guessed that she was just deliberately intimidating him. But he still couldn't help but feel nervous. This was the sorrow of the weak. He hated himself for being weak. At the same time, his mind quickly turned to various escape methods. In addition to the dead, there are many ways to shut people up. The girl in the Tang suit gently smiled. "I didn't expect that a person who is so afraid of death like you would dare to attack the Splitter. It's really impressive." Her eyes looked at Dean as she spoke. Dean's heart shivered. He knew that she had noticed the tungsten steel chain on the Splitter's body. How would I dare to attack it? If I knew that there was such a big guy here, then I wouldn't have come out to hunt. The injuries on its body should be caused by someone as strong as you. I'm just an intermediate hunter. I don't have such ability. The girl in the Tang suit said, "There are a few undeads on the ground. It's obvious that they were killed by someone. Your shoes are stained with blood. Is it a coincidence? Besides, as far as I know, anyone who can come here to kill the Splitter would never use such a method to attack it. You don't need to deny it. You're just an intermediate hunter, but you dare to come here to hunt this evil beast. I admire you." Dean's face changed when he heard her words. He didn't bother to criticize her and said in an old-fashioned tone, "I admit that the injury on its body was caused by me. I just borrowed the power of some tools, so I was lucky enough to hurt it." The girl in the Tang suit narrowed her eyes as she looked at Dean from head to toe. After a moment, there was a smile on her face. "Well, it's rare to meet an interesting little guy. What is your name?" Dean was speechless as he heard her call him little guy. He believed that the girl in the Tang suit was not an old witch, but a genuine little girl. Of course, it may be related to her own strength. Her strength caused her to look down on her peers. He thought for a moment and truthfully said, "My name is Dean. What about you?" The girl in the Tang suit was interested. "You dare to ask my name? It's impolite not to reciprocate." Dean said, "You know my name, and I know yours. It's fair." The girl in the Tang suit said, "It's fair, but aren't you afraid that I'll kill you?" "I'm afraid." Dean looked at her. "But if you want to kill me, it won't be because I asked your name." Chapter 335. Dean was silent for a moment. Indeed, the difference between the inner wall and the outer wall was difficult to cross even for the ancient nobles like Mir and Boron. No matter how famous he was in the outer wall, as long as he didn't enter the inner wall, he was nothing. This beast has been stirring up trouble outside the giant wall recently. I have received a commission to come and kill it. The girl looked at Dean with interest. Originally, with my ability to kill it, I would be injured and even let it run away. But I didn't expect that it would fall into the hands of a little hunter like you. Let me pick up a bargain for nothing. Speaking of which, I owe you a favor. Dean's mouth slightly twitched. He had been refining the cannon and improving the shark lance for several days and nights. The purpose was to kill the Splitter before it was exposed. He didn't expect that he would be one step late. The movement caused by the Splitter had spread to the inner wall in just a few days. The person who passed the news was obviously the Holy Church. Even the force behind the girl was likely the Holy Church. The Tang suit girl saw Dean's expressionless face, and her mouth revealed a smile. Every time she saw others angry to the point of being unable to refute, she felt incomparable pleasure. At this moment, she leisurely said, "It's impossible for you to get the parasitic soul worm of this legendary monster. Although I don't need this thing, but the people above have already regarded this thing as a thing in the bag. Moreover, with your physique, giving it to you will harm you. If you didn't meet me, even if you were lucky enough to kill this splitter, you would be buried with it." Dean had already dispelled the coveting for the magic marks when he saw her strength. He couldn't help but frown. "Buried with me?" The girl said, "Of course, if you get the parasitic soul worm, you will certainly be eager to absorb it to replace your current magic marks, right? In this way, you will die. Once the parasitic soul worm enters your body, you will be sucked dry in less than 2 days." Dean was startled. He had never heard of such a thing. But with the girl's strength, there should be no need to deceive him. Was she deliberately teasing him? He doubtfully said, "Will the parasitic soul worm be life-threatening? Won't it die when it enters my body? How can it suck me dry?" The girl in the tang suit rolled her eyes and said, "Of course it's life-threatening. You'll choke to death even if you drink water, let alone such a dangerous thing. Why don't you think about it? This parasitic soul worm has been living inside Splitter's body all this time. This is an adult splitter with hunting level 68. How strong is its body? Although the parasitic soul worm will die after entering your body, its instincts will still exist. This instinct is responsible for transforming your body, providing you with the power of the magic marks. At the same time, it will instinctively absorb the energy from your body. In other words, the parasitic soul worm is used to absorbing the energy from Splitter's body. With your physique, it will be impossible for you to provide so much energy. In the end, the parasitic soul worm will be devoured by the magic marks and die. Dean was stunned. The girl said, "You hunters don't know about this because no one is able to kill a monster that is several times stronger than their physical strength. You are an intermediate hunter, and yet you dare to kill an adult legendary monster. You're the first person in history to do so. But some big forces have already verified that the human body can only absorb parasitic soul worms within 20 hunting ranks. In other words, a commoner can only absorb the magic marks of a monster within 20 hunting ranks. If the parasitic soul worm is absorbed from a monster of 21 or 22 hunting ranks, then there will be a backlash from the magic marks. Even if it's a monster of 17, 18, or 19, it's still very risky. The slightest bit of carelessness can cause a backlash from the magic marks. To put it simply, the most extreme absorption is 20 hunting ranks, and the safest absorption is 10 hunting ranks. If you absorb a parasitic soul worm that is 15 hunting ranks higher than you, the probability of the magic marks backlash will gradually increase. Dean looked at her serious appearance. He knew that she should not be teasing him. His heart was afraid and regretful. Fortunately, he had a little splitter hidden inside the giant wall. In the future, it could provide him with magic marks. You're talking about the inner wall's evaluation of the monsters. Do we humans also have a hunting level? Dudian asked. The girl in the tang suit said, "Of course, but we humans don't have a clear division of hunting levels. We just use different positions to replace them. For example, a primary hunter has a corresponding hunting level from 1 to 8. If you reach the limit, then it is about 10. If you are an intermediate hunter, then your physical strength is close to the monster that is level 20. So, if you are an intermediate hunter, then you can only absorb the parasitic soul worm within level 40. Even if you kill the monster that is above level 40, you can't absorb it. You can only store it or resell it. There is no special method to store it." The girl in the tang suit looked at Dean. "If it was an average person, I would be too lazy to talk about this. There is almost no one who can cross 20 hunting levels to kill a monster, including me." Dean wryly smiled. He thought that it was useless if he couldn't absorb the parasitic soul worm. In the future, if you're lucky and don't die outside the giant wall, then you can go to the Dragon Clan to find me. The girl calmly looked at Dean. "If I die, then I didn't say anything. You better not show off this matter in the outer wall." If the people of the Dragon Clan know that someone is using the name of the Dragon Clan to show off in the outer wall, then your end will be very miserable. Dragon Clan? Dean was startled. He whispered and secretly remembered these two words. You can keep the body of the splitter. The girl said some of the materials on its body are good, especially the two main scythes. They could be made into a set of excellent double-scythed weapons. But the outer wall doesn't have such high smelting technology. Some of the other materials are of good value, but I'm too lazy to take them back. It's too cumbersome. Dean's eyelids twitched. This was the body of a legendary monster. It was a treasure, but she was too lazy to take it back? How lazy could she be? However, he didn't get the magic marks, but the body of the splitter was of great value. Puff! The girl in the Tang suit pulled out the blood-baron sword and wrapped a bandage around her back. She was ready to leave. Suddenly, she thought of something. Her eyebrows slightly moved as she looked at Dean. I will tell you one more thing. Although you may not be able to use it, but consider it as a personal gift from me. It can be regarded as a meeting gift for you to join our Dragon Clan in the future. But now I can only give you a gift box. There is no actual gift. Dean was surprised as he looked at her. Although I don't know what your current magic mark is, the probability of hunting a rare named monster in this unclaimed area is not high. However, there's a way to let you have a magic mark that is comparable to a rare named monster. The girl in the Tang suit slowly said, this method is called deified magic mark. The method is very simple. If you obtain a rare grade magic mark, then you only need to find 5 monsters of the same type and feed their parasitic soul worms to the magic mark. That way, the magic mark will undergo a deification transformation. If the deification transformation is successful, the magic marks will have a new ability, and the effect will be close to the rare magic marks. That is to say, for example, if you have a rare level magic mark of Corpse Eater, and you absorb 5 magic marks of Corpse Eater, then there's a chance to trigger the deification of the magic marks. Generally speaking, if you absorb 5, the probability of deification is 50%. With each absorption, the probability of deification will increase by about 10%. The girl in the Tang suit looked at Dean and said, the advantage of deification is that you don't need to replace the magic marks, but you can improve the original magic marks by a level. So rare magic marks are comparable to rare magic marks, and ordinary magic marks are comparable to rare magic marks. But the disadvantages of deification are also very big. Absorbing the same kind of magic marks can't make the magic marks grow and improve the physique. Moreover, the absorption process can't be mixed with other magic marks, otherwise you will have to start all over again. Dean was a little surprised. There was such a secret in the magic marks. The deification of the magic marks was like an optimization. On the basis of the original magic marks, the magic marks could be stimulated again and new magic marks could be obtained. Generally speaking, this method was used for people whose strength had reached a bottleneck. They could use the deification of the magic marks to enhance their strength again. But compared with its advantages, there were too many disadvantages and disadvantages. The first one was to find the same kind of monsters, which was simply an impossible problem. According to the girl in the Tang suit, the 5 monsters used for the deification of the magic marks must be of the same kind. For example, if he wanted to deification of the deification, he had to swallow 5 more Corpse Eater of the deification. It would not work if he swallowed other rare monsters. Moreover, in the process of deification of the magic marks, his own strength could not be improved. For example, his physique had reached the limit of intermediate hunter. He only needed to get 2 parasitic soul worms to break through to senior hunter. Once the bottleneck of physique was broken, he could continue to rely on the absorption of cold crystals and God's blessing to enhance his strength. But if he absorbed the Corpse Eater magic marks, it would not break the bottleneck of physique. Even if he absorbed 5 Corpse Eater magic marks, it would only improve the ability of the magic marks, but the physique bottleneck would still be there. Moreover, in the process of absorbing 5 Corpse Eater, he was not allowed to absorb other parasitic soul worms to break the physique bottleneck. Once he chose to deification, He had to wait until the magic marks were deified. Otherwise, it would all be wasted. No wonder the girl in the tang suit said that he might not be able to use such harsh conditions. Not to mention him, it was estimated that no one in the entire outer wall would be able to use this method. The girl in the tang suit saw that Dean was in a daze. She smiled and put away her things. She jumped down from the body of the splitter and landed on the ground. She turned to look at Dean. If you have the opportunity to join our dragon family, you can choose a rare magic mark for free. So you have to find some life-saving magic marks and live well. As he spoke, he turned his head with a smile. With a tap of his toes, he leaped out of the train that was more than 10 meters high and landed on the ground. His figure floated away and directly left. Dean watched her back disappear into the hole. He was startled for a moment and slowly retracted his eyes. There was a bit of bitterness in his mouth. Although he was glad that he couldn't absorb the magic marks of the splitter, but he couldn't help but regret that the prey fell into the hands of others. Or it should be said that it fell into the hands of the group of people who had real power inside the giant wall. Sitting inside the wall, even if it was the magic mark of a legendary monster, there would be people hunting it and sending it to him. Compared with such a character, he was still too small. He sighed and looked down at the splitter under his feet. Suddenly, his eyelids fiercely jumped and his heart beat wildly. Egg! There are eggs! Dean suddenly thought of the cave of the splitter. He felt that his whole body's blood was boiling, especially when he thought of the words of the girl in the tang suit. Even with his mental strength, he couldn't help but breathe fast. His eyes were red. He quickly turned around and ran along the stairs out of the subway. He didn't even care about the body of the splitter on the ground. His mind quickly constructed a map of the surroundings. According to the memory of the last time, he ran towards the cave of the splitter. Run, run, run. Dean's legs were flying. His ears were full of whistling wind. His heart was full of tension and strong excitement. Although the splitter was dead, but there were still eggs in its cave. Moreover, the last time Dean saw that there were a lot of eggs. So many eggs, if all of them hatched, he could even use the magic marks of the splitter to carry out deification. Legendary deification, ah. As he thought of this, his heart was pounding. What level would the legendary magic marks be after deification? Unimaginable. Whoosh, whoosh. Dean was like a gust of wind as he rushed towards Splitter's cave. Whoosh. A giant shadow jumped out of the grass and attacked Dean. Dean, who was running, was startled. His body reflexively dodged the giant shadow. He looked back and saw that it was a chameleon. Its body was nearly 7 meters long. It had a crocodile-like mouth and sharp fangs. It was rushing towards him. Jungle chameleon. Dean's face slightly changed. This was a level 17 monster. He quickly jumped away. At the same time, he quickly pulled out an arrow and shot at the mouth of the lizard. Puff. Chapter 336. Dean took the opportunity to pull away from the lizard and turned around to shoot again. Puff! Another arrow hit the lizard's mouth. The distance between the two was more than 10 meters. The speed of the arrow was extremely fast. After the 2 arrows hit, Dean estimated that even if it didn't die, it would be seriously injured. After the inspiration brought by the improved shark lance, in addition to filling his own arrows with mercury, he also left about a centimeter of paralysis venom inside. This effect was hundreds of times stronger than smearing venom on the arrowhead. Dean didn't pay any more attention to the chameleon. He left it to fend for itself. He turned around and continued to run forward. However, the ambush of the chameleon had calmed down a lot. He didn't dare to rush blindly. After all, this was a dangerous wilderness. He didn't want to fall into the belly of other monsters before he reached the cave of the splitter. That would be the end of the world. Whoosh! Dean shook off the injured chameleon and soon came to the place where he had encountered the magic claw crocodile quagmire. The quagmire was the same as last time, but the soil had become dry and hard. There was no movement of the magic claw crocodiles. Plus, the weather was cold, so the water in the swamp had dried up a lot. Dean stopped and sniffed the air around him. The function of smell was very low when running. It was the same as ordinary people. That's why the hounds would stop and sniff every time they tracked a place. Soon, through the surrounding smells, Dean roughly grasped some information. He carefully sneaked forward. An hour later, Dean finally came to the vicinity of the Splitter's cave. Originally, it would only take him 10 minutes to reach the place, but he had to stop along the way. He was always vigilant against the monsters hidden in the ruins and jungle. Sometimes he would encounter strange smells that blocked his way, so he had to take a detour. It took him several times longer to reach the place. Dean looked at the cave from afar. He was relieved when he saw the boulders outside the cave. He quietly groped and looked up and down. It was difficult to drill into the cave. He was lying on top of a pile of boulders, listening attentively and sniffing with his nose. Through the cracks between the boulders, he could smell a thick, rotten smell of blood. This bloody smell was mixed with many other strange smells. Obviously, it was the corpses of several monsters that Splitter had hunted. There was also a strong smell of the Splitter. Dean sniffed and soon smelled the scent of a small Splitter. Although this cave was a Splitter's cave, but there were subtle differences in the smells of the big and small Splitters. Just like the body odor of different people would be different. Did it hatch again? Dean was surprised and happy. Every young Splitter would be a legendary monster in the future. Its value was infinite. He took 2 steps back and looked around. There was nothing he could use. He was a little disappointed. He estimated his strength. If he went into the cave, he would become a living food for the little Splitter. After all, the little Splitter wasn't the same as the one he brought into the inner wall. It didn't mistake him for its own kind and didn't attack him. I don't know how many eggs are inside. I have to find a way to drill into the cave. If there are less than 5, then I have to give up the deification and replace it with something else. The value of a legendary magic mark should be enough to alarm the inner wall. It shouldn't be a problem to bring down a consortium from the outer wall. Dean secretly calculated in his heart. After all, if the number of Splitter's eggs was not enough, then he didn't know how many years it would take for him to encounter a new Splitter. The probability was too low. During this period, his strength would remain at the intermediate level. Even if he was an intermediate hunter with legendary magic mark ability, it was still too weak. Especially this time when he saw the girl in the Tang suit. He saw the evolved form of a senior hunter. Even senior hunters wouldn't have the power to fight back in front of the ladder. Such combat power could ignore the rules of the outer wall and sweep away the 6 consortiums. Of course, this was only theoretically feasible. After all, the structure of society was inextricably linked. It wasn't possible to do whatever one wanted just because one had enough fighting power. There may be other underlying rules behind it. If the 6 consortiums were violently destroyed, then the economy of the outer wall would collapse and the outer wall would fall into chaos. It was bound to attract the attention of the inner wall, and most likely they would intervene to suppress the situation. Dean wasn't a reckless man, so he wouldn't do such a reckless thing. He would play his part to the best of his character. These Splitters must be raised to the growth stage. These Splitters need to be raised until they reach adulthood before they can breed magic marks. Fortunately, Splitters grow very fast. From newborn to infancy only takes 5 to 7 days, and from infancy to adulthood takes 1 to 2 months. In other words, they need to hatch and be raised for 2 months before they can be hunted for parasitic soulworms. The little Splitters that have already hatched must be crippled and fed like pigs. Otherwise, when they reach adulthood, their strength will soar rapidly and reach hunting level 30 to 40. At that time, there will be no chance of winning. Dean thought for a moment and immediately started to dig a pit outside the cave to make a trap. I have to build a stronghold outside the giant wall as soon as possible. Like other consortiums' hunting areas, there are hunter strongholds to provide services such as communication, replenishment of food, healing, and so on. This will greatly reduce the hunter's sacrifice and improve the hunting efficiency. Dean thought as he dug the pit. He didn't have any tools in his hand, so the efficiency of making traps in the pit was slow. After half an hour, he dug a big pit. He used the ropes and arrows he had with him to make a simple trap in the pit. Although it was a common beast trap, but the word common often meant excellent. Only excellent and effective would be widely used. Dean came to the boulders in front of the cave after the trap was made. He moved the boulders down and arranged them in different directions. He placed them outside the cave and around the trap, like chess pieces. The purpose of this was to limit the activities of large monsters like Splitter. Dean rested several times on the way. After an hour, Dean finally moved a small gap in the boulder pile. It was located at the top of the boulder pile, which was connected to the cave. With the appearance of the gap, the strong smell of rotten meat drifted out of the cave, making Dudian's stomach churn. His keen sense of smell made his face extremely ugly at this moment. Dean endured the pungent smell and climbed to the top of the boulder pile. He looked down and saw a figure in the dark cave. It looked like countless swords were tied together. At the same time, the sound of stones falling came from the bottom of the boulder pile. He looked down and saw a small Splitter climbing up the boulder pile. Dean's face slightly changed. He didn't know whether to be happy or bitter. The difficulty of hunting two Splitters had increased by several times. He quickly jumped down from the boulder pile and ran to the edge of the boulder pile, more than 50 meters away. This was the best hunting angle he had prepared. The sound of stones echoed from time to time in the cave. After a moment, Splitter's body was revealed at the entrance of the cave. This Splitter was a bit smaller than the one Dean had used to enter the inner wall. The color of the carapace was black, and the luster was deeper and more gorgeous. It seemed to be well-developed and full of nutrition. Dean squinted his eyes and aimed the arrow. He wasn't in a hurry to shoot, but waited for Splitter to climb out of the gap. Then he aimed at its eyeball. He was familiar with the structure of Splitter's body after a long time of observation. At the moment, the arrow was aimed at its weakness. Whoosh! The arrow passed in the blink of an eye. The Splitter was lying on top of the boulder pile. It seemed to be looking around. It was curious about everything in the outside world. Even the warm sunshine made it feel very novel. Just as it was sizing up the place, a sharp whistling sound suddenly rang out. Puff! The arrow had hit the Splitter's body by the time it recovered. The arrow was too sudden and too fast. Moreover, it was the first time Splitter had come out of the cave, so it hadn't been able to adapt to the strong sunlight yet. Therefore, it was hit by the arrow without any suspense. Moreover, the arrow had hit its eyeball at the core of its body. Squeak! Splitter screamed in pain. Its body swayed from side to side. If it had been hit as soon as it crawled to the gap, it would have fallen into the cave due to the pain. But now it was lying in the gap between the rock pile and the cave dome. It couldn't move forward or retreat, nor could it hide. It kept screaming in pain. Dean breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the arrow hit its target. He put the arrow on the string again and looked at its swaying body. His eyes narrowed tightly. The irregular swaying made it difficult for him to predict its movements. Blinding one of its eyeballs was not enough to completely eliminate its combat effectiveness. After all, it was a legendary monster. In terms of species level, it had evolved extremely far ahead. Even if it lost its eyeballs, it still had other ways to sense the surrounding danger, but it was not as convenient and fast as using its eyes. Whoosh! The second arrow was shot. This time it aimed at its screaming mouth. Whoosh! As he swung his sharp limbs in a chaotic manner, he accidentally knocked down the arrows that were flying towards him. Dean frowned, but he wasn't discouraged. He put the third arrow. It seemed that he was ready for this. He aimed at the mouth of Splitter again. Splitter's limbs touched the arrow. It seemed to sense the direction of the arrow. It screamed and waved its limbs to form a shield. It firmly protected the front of its body. At the same time, it retreated. Bang! The arrow hit the sharp-edged shield and immediately broke. Dean's face sank. Although it was still a juvenile, but its hunting level was around 24 or 25. It wasn't easy to kill it. He took out an arrow and knocked it, quietly waiting for an opportunity. However, the opportunity never appeared again. The Splitter had a strong sense of self-protection. It used the shield to protect the vital parts of its body. It retreated all the way into the cave. Dean picked up the stones on the ground and threw them at the Splitter. The stones fell into the cave. After a moment, the sound of breaking echoed from the cave. Soon another Splitter climbed out of the cave. There was no injury on its body. It should be another one. Dean was happy to see the splitter try and climb out. He aimed at its eyeball and shot the arrow when it was halfway through the cave. Puff! The arrow immediately hit its target. The little splitter had just excitedly climbed halfway when it was suddenly attacked. It immediately let out a painful scream. Dean continued to shoot the arrow. Whoosh! Whoosh! When the little splitter received the attack, it didn't react immediately. Its sharp blades weren't concentrated, so its mouth was suddenly hit by an arrow. Its screams suddenly rose by hundreds of decibels, and then it quickly stopped. It waved its sharp limbs and retreated into the cave. Dean saw that its sharp limbs were waving like a circle, airtight, so he immediately stopped shooting and saved the arrows. Dean was relieved as the splitter retreated back into the cave. In general, the first round of ambush was successful. Although the splitter's strength was amazing and their body structure was extremely strong, but they were still inexperienced. From this point, it could be seen that deceit was far more terrible than violence. Dean crawled on the ground and listened carefully. Although the splitter was still in its infancy stage, but its physique was bigger than most of the level 20 monsters. The ground vibrated as it moved. Dean could roughly determine the position of the cave. Perhaps it was because of the injury that the splitter retreated into the cave. Dean got up and put the arrow on the bow. He bent down and ran towards the cave. He climbed to the top of the cave and looked inside. There were two little splitters swaying in the depths of the cave. They didn't make the previous harsh screams. It seemed that they had learned a lot. Dean aimed the arrow. One of the little splitters swayed into the corner. Behind the corner was a pile of monsters' corpses in the deepest part of the cave. The other little splitter was injured. It was moving very slowly. Dudian saw the excretion on its back. If he shot, then he would be able to hit it. However, he stopped and didn't shoot. The two arrows had hit the weak points of the splitter. The venom and mercury inside the arrows could cause great damage to the splitter's body. If he continued to shoot, then the venom inside the arrows could directly poison the splitter to death. Dean grabbed a small stone and threw it toward the splitter. The previous great splitter's venom had taken effect very quickly, in less than half an hour. Although it was related to the amount of venom, this little splitter's venom should take effect within an hour. Even from this moment on, the venom would slowly corrode every part of its body. Bang! The stone hit the little splitter's body. The little splitter rolled its body as if it was startled. It turned around and saw the intruder at the entrance. Its underdeveloped vocal cords squeaked. It seemed that it wanted to rush over to the intruder, but it was hesitant, so it just squeaked in a defensive manner. Chapter 337. Splitter saw Dean lying on the pile of stones in the cave. It roared in anger and rushed over. Dean was waiting for it. He moved the arrow and aimed at it. Whoosh! The arrow flew out in an instant. Splitter's body was slightly bigger than the previous one. At the moment when the arrow flew out, it suddenly waved its sharp limbs to block in front of its body. Bang! The arrowhead hit its sharp blade, and the arrowhead broke and exploded. The mercury and venom inside mixed together and splashed like gray raindrops, scattering all over its body. Splitter roared in a low voice and suddenly jumped on top of a pile of boulders. Then it clamped the boulders with its claws and quickly climbed up. Dean put away the bow and arrow and pushed the boulder next to him. Bang! The little splitter was caught off guard. It was hit by the boulder and fell down. The boulder pressed down on its body. Its sharp limbs struggled to push the boulder away. Dean aimed the arrow and squinted his eyes to observe. Splitter exerted all his strength to push the boulder away from his body. The moment the boulder was pushed away, an arrow shot out and hit the place behind the boulder. It was the second eye at the core of Splitter's body. It had a field of vision of 180 degrees. It could observe the surroundings and the ground. If there were other monsters lurking in the soil waiting for an opportunity to attack, Splitter would be able to react in an instant. Squeak! Splitter screamed in pain. It waved its sharp limbs to sweep left and right to prevent any danger from approaching. At the same time, it retreated. At this time, another injured Splitter came over. It raised its sharp limbs to protect Splitter as it slowly retreated. It knew how to cover and cooperate. Dean was startled as he saw that they had retreated to the corner. He grabbed the stone and threw it at them. However, this time, the two little Splitters were not attracted to him again. It was obvious that they had been fooled once and had learned their lesson. Dean put away the bow and arrow. After a moment, his eyes lit up and his mouth curved into a smile. He came out of the cave and pulled out some weeds and green vines from the ground. He tied the withered weeds and green vines together. He found some dry and hardwood and returned to Splitter's cave. He had been paying attention to the movements in the cave in case the little Splitter sneaked out again. Fortunately, they seemed to be seriously injured as they didn't make any movement in the cave. Dean threw a stone from far away to test the hole in the cave. He waited for a moment, but the Splitter didn't come out. He carefully climbed up the hole and looked inside. He didn't see the two little Splitters at the corner. Apparently, they had hidden in the corner of the cave. Dean smirked and took out a match to ignite the weeds. Soon, a raging flame was burning. He put the dry hardwood on top of it. When it was burning, he wiped out the flame, and suddenly there was a burst of smoke. He then covered the weeds with green vines to extinguish the flame, and suddenly it turned into a lot of smoke. He found some leaves that looked like banana leaves and used them as a fan, fanning the thick smoke out of the cave. The thick smoke surged into the cave and floated into it. Under the continuous attack of the smoke, after half an hour, the two little Splitters finally couldn't bear it anymore and slowly crawled out. Their movements were slow and seemed to be weak. Dean smirked and continued to vigorously fan the smoke. At the same time, he used the surrounding stones to fill the entrance of the cave, making the entrance narrower. The two little Splitters couldn't make a sound. They made hoarse hissing sounds. It seemed like they were begging and indignant. Dean waited for them to come close, then immediately picked up a big stone and threw it. The two little Splitters were slow. One of them couldn't dodge and was hit by the stone. It fell to the ground. The other little Splitter was scared when it saw the fierce intruder. It didn't dare to get close to the cave. Dean wasn't in a hurry. He sat steadily at the entrance and continued to fan the smoke to consume their physical strength. The smoke wasn't just to choke people. After all, there was a big difference between monsters and humans and beasts. Especially monsters that had evolved to a very high level could even be immune to the smoke. However, the real purpose of Dean's smoke wasn't to choke them, but to reduce the oxygen in the cave. No matter what kind of monster it was, oxygen was indispensable. Perhaps they could lose oxygen for a long time, but it was impossible to lose oxygen permanently. The reduction of oxygen was bound to cause dizziness, weakness, and other symptoms. Hiss! The little Splitter that was pressed by the stone struggled to turn over its body. It slowly crawled back. It seemed to be afraid and angry as it looked at Dean. Dean saw the appearance of the two little Splitters. He knew that they were extremely weak. He could even defeat them in close combat. However, he wouldn't jump down and fight them in close combat. He continued to fan the smoke and waited. An hour passed in the blink of an eye. The two little Splitters tried to rush out of the smoke-filled cave several times, but they were knocked back by the stones thrown by Dean. Every time they failed, it would result in a loss of physical strength. The two little Splitters gradually gave up the plan to rush out of the cave. They retreated to a lower part of the cave where the smoke was slightly lower. Dean looked at the two little Splitters that were dying. He secretly sighed in his heart. Who would have thought that a mere smoke could push the legendary monsters to this point? Even if they were in their infancy stage, they were at level 24 or 25. The Black Weaver that Glenn had killed was only a level 26 existence. Dean threw two small stones from time to time towards the two little Splitters. The two little Splitters resisted at first, but later they lay on the ground and let Dean throw stones at them. They didn't resist at all. Seeing this, Dean was relieved, but he still continued to fan for about 10 minutes. When he stopped, a large amount of smoke came out of the hole. Obviously, the capacity inside was already saturated. Dean jumped into the cave after the smoke came out a little. He pulled out the dagger from his waist. He turned around and picked up a big stone from the ground. He bent down and quietly approached the two little splitters. The two little splitters did not move. He walked more than 10 meters away, raised a big stone, and threw it at one of them. Bang! The big stone smashed into the little splitter's body. The sharp pain woke it up, but it didn't jump up. Instead, it struggled to turn over its body. The movement of its blade-like limbs was incomparably slow. It seemed that lifting it was extremely difficult. Dean didn't hesitate to pull out an arrow from the quiver. He aimed and shot at the core of the splitter's body. He pulled a rope and slowly dragged the splitter's body away from the other splitter. The little splitter was weaker than Dean had imagined. It just twitched a little but didn't resist. Dean waved the dagger to cut the joints of its blade-like limbs. Puff! The joints were stabbed. The little splitter screamed in pain and waved its other blade-like limbs to cut Dean. Dean easily bent down to avoid the stab. He grabbed the limb that was stabbed in the joint and pulled it out. With a splash of blood, the blade-like limb was pulled out forcefully. The little splitter screamed in pain. Its sharp limbs were like an iron ball. Dean was forced to retreat. He waited for the little splitter to stop. He approached it and continued to attack the other sharp limbs. Splitter's limbs were pulled out by Dean after a few minutes. Its body was like a huge peanut-shaped insect. Its surface was covered with a layer of dark carapace. It was like an armor protecting its body. Dean didn't pay attention to it. He continued to attack the other little splitter. 5 minutes later, the second little splitter was also pulled out by Dean. It lost the ability to fight. Dean gasped for a moment and jumped out of the cave. He took a few deep breaths of fresh air to replace the smoke in his lungs. He went back into the cave and tied up the two little splits that had lost their fighting ability. He dragged them to the corner of the cave and looked inside. The scene inside was almost the same as the last time he saw it. There were still piles of corpses that were 7 or 8 meters high, and the ground was covered with blood. There were all kinds of monsters on the pile of corpses, but he did not look carefully. He quickly went around the pile of corpses and immediately saw the nest behind it. There were a few giant eggs lying in the nest. He went closer and found that these giant eggs were even taller than him. He circled the nest and counted them. His eyes widened and were filled with surprise. 5? There are 5 more? Plus these 2. Isn't there a total of 7? If you count the one in the inner wall, then there are 8. 8 legendary monsters. How could he not be excited? It meant that he could increase the probability of deification of the splitter to 70%. With such a high probability, it was completely worth it. Dean sighed and turned to the pile of monster corpses next to the nest. He looked around but didn't see any named monster's corpse. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Then he thought that the named monster's corpse had parasitic soulworm. This thing should be a great tonic for Great Splitter. After all, humans relied on parasitic soulworm to improve their magic mark's ability. Most monsters would also need it. Dean looked at the 2 little splitters. His eyes flashed for a moment. He grabbed 2 corpses of the Tibetan Mastiff and threw them in front of the 2 little splitters. The 2 little splitters saw the food. They wriggled their bodies and moved closer to the food. But they didn't have sharp limbs, so it was very difficult for them to eat with their mouths. Dean didn't care about this. He didn't continue to stay in the smoke. He returned to the outside of the cave. He thought, the cruel predation of the monster world has created the living areas of the monsters. Just like the giant wall is divided into 3 areas: the poor, the people, and the merchants. Most of the monsters in this area are level 20 to 35. The splitter chose to lay eggs here because the monsters here are weak. It's not easy to hurt its children. Moreover, its children can have a more suitable living environment after leaving the cave. Among the monsters around level 20 to 35, there are 2 types of monsters that like to hunt for the young and eggs of other prey. The first is the brown spider fly, which is level 21. It is short and extremely sensitive to the smell of monsters that are about to give birth. It likes to follow these monsters and wait for the opportunity to hunt for the young or eggs that they lay. The second one is the widow frog. It doesn't only like to eat the eggs or cubs of other monsters, but also its own cubs. So every female widow frog will stay away from the male widow frog when they are pregnant. They regard the male as the natural enemy of the beast. Dean raised his head and looked around The terrain here is dry. It should be the suburbs of the city. There are many hills. Frogs like to appear in humid areas, so there shouldn't be any nearby. But we have to guard against spider flies. There are a lot of them, and their weakness is obvious. They are afraid of large monsters. They don't dare to attack any large monsters. They're a typical bully. Splitter won't dare to attack, even if it's a juvenile. I don't need to set up traps to guard against anything. I just need to be careful of other beasts. Don't be attracted by the smell of blood in the cave. He came to the cave and moved the boulders to block the hole again. He looked around, but didn't see any movement. He quickly turned and left. I don't have much time. I have to raise this place as soon as possible. Splitter has been hunting nearby recently, so no monsters dare to come close. But as time goes on, there will inevitably be monsters migrating over and breaking into the forbidden area. Dean thought as he returned. He walked and stopped along the way. He bypassed some strange smells and smoothly returned to the body of Splitter. As soon as he jumped into the subway, he saw a huge sickle walking dead, gnawing on the body of Splitter. His face sank. Previously, not all the walking dead in the subway were killed, so there were a lot of them left. This walking dead was probably the bravest monster among all the monsters. Even in the face of Splitter, it dared to attack. At the moment, the body of this sickle undead was much bigger than ordinary undead. It was nearly 3 meters tall. The muscles of its whole body were bulging. It was extremely bloated. The clothes that were about to be fibrous burst open. Only a few dirty fibers were left. Fortunately, there were still some pants hanging on its butt. Dean could recognize that it was the undead from the subway. The sickle undead also noticed Dean when Dean was looking at it. It roared and rushed toward Dean. Dean's eyes were cold. He immediately put an arrow and aimed at its forehead. Puff! The arrow suddenly flew. This undead had the same physique as the mutated sickle undead that Dean had encountered before. However, facing the arrow, it didn't have the slightest consciousness to avoid. Puff! The arrow suddenly went into its head, and its huge body crashed to the ground. Dean was slightly startled. He didn't expect it to be so easy to solve. He knew that the undead would not pretend to be dead. He immediately jumped over when it didn't move. He saw that the muscles on its body were bloated and hard. It was like stepping on a stone. The muscles were covered with blood-colored tubes. The luster was bright, as if it was going to burst out of the muscles. Roar! When Dean was observing, another roar came from the other side of Splitter's body. It was another undead that was as huge and bloated as this one. Dean's face changed slightly, and he quickly pulled out the arrow. As soon as his hand touched the quiver, he found that there were not many arrows left in the quiver. He grabbed an arrow, put on the quiver, quickly aimed, and shot out. Puff! The arrow swept in a straight line and accurately hit the undead's forehead. Chapter 338. Dean frowned and raised his hand to pull out the arrow from the forehead of the bloated undead. This arrow was just an ordinary fine iron arrow. Using mercury-poisoned arrows to hunt undead was a complete waste. Moreover, there were not many mercury-poisoned arrows left in his quiver, so he had to use them sparingly. In this silent subway, the roar of the 2 bloated undead was extremely loud. When the second bloated undead fell under the arrow, there was another roar. He saw from behind the body of the huge Splitter, 2 more bloated undead came out. One of the bloated undead was cut off from the chest, leaving only the upper body swollen. Its face was full of bulging flesh and blood. The mouth and eyeballs were squeezed into the flesh like a balloon filled with air. Dean saw the appearance of the half of the undead. He didn't expect that it would evolve because of the flesh and blood of the Splitter. Was it not the stomach that it used to digest food? Was it other organs? Or any tissue of the whole body? This idea passed quickly in his mind. He raised the arrow in his hand and quickly aimed to shoot. Puff! Puff! 2 bloated undead were pierced by the sword and nailed to the ground. Dean saw that these bloated corpses had no intelligence, and his heart was relieved. Although their speed, after being bloated, was much stronger than the general ordinary corpses, even more than the level 9 scythe corpses, close to the level 15 monsters, but they did not know how to avoid the danger, but became his own live target. Roar! Roar! From the body of the splitter, the bloated undead climbed out one after another. They roared and rushed to Dean. Dean quickly pulled out the arrow and shot it. After shooting one, he quickly rushed over to pull out the arrow and recycle it. In a blink of an eye, in just 4 or 5 minutes, 14 or 15 undead from the splitter's body were all shot dead by Dean. 2 arrows were scrapped in the repeated recycling. There were only 4 ordinary arrows and 2 mercury poison arrows left. Dean saw that there were no bloated undead crawling out. He immediately pulled out the dagger and bent down to cut the head of the undead, whose gender was difficult to distinguish. He saw that the swollen flesh outside the skull was extremely hard, like steel. The dagger cut into the skull and dug a small hole along the hole in the neck. He skillfully pulled out some intracranial tissue. Soon, he found a dark blue crystal in a relatively cold intracranial tissue. Dean picked up the cold crystal. It was about half the size of the ordinary undead. It was closer to the cold crystal in the skull of the sickle undead. He guessed that if these bloated undead lived for a while, the nutrients in their bodies would promote the size of the cold crystal to become bigger. According to his previous experience of absorbing cold crystal, the bigger the cold crystal was, the purer the color was, and the more obvious the absorption effect was. These cold crystals could be worth 2 to 3 ordinary undead. Dean's eyes flashed for a moment. He suddenly thought of something. He couldn't help but shine. The flesh and blood of the splitter contains rich energy. These ordinary withered undead, trapped in the subway, can evolve like this in such a short time after eating its flesh and blood. If these flesh and blood are given to the splitter to eat, won't it soon promote their body to enter the growth period? Thinking of this, he suddenly became a little excited. He quickly collected the cold crystals in the skulls of more than a dozen swollen corpses on the ground. Then he looked around the subway to see if there were any living corpses that he missed. Soon, he found several corpses that fell on the subway track. He killed them and picked up the cold crystals. After confirming that there were no living undead left, he returned to the splitter and thought about how to carry its flesh and blood to the splitter's cave. If he directly cut it and carried it, the flesh and blood would exude a tempting smell. He didn't know how many monsters would covet it along the way. Although the splitter was able to intimidate everyone when it was alive, the smell emitted by its corpse after death was like a sumptuous feast to these ordinary monsters. I have to go back to the giant wall and find some transport tools. Now it's evening and the temperature is getting low. Monsters like to come out to hunt. It's too dangerous to carry at night. I have to go back and prepare the tools. Dean looked at the huge body of the splitter and turned to go out of the underground subway station. Although the body of the splitter would inevitably attract nearby monsters, but he didn't have the tools to cover the smell. He had to abandon it for the time being. After all, it wasn't like there was a pillow sent to him when he dozed off. However, due to the structure of the splitter's body, these monsters could only gnaw its flesh and blood. They couldn't hurt its sharp limbs. These sharp limbs were the most valuable material of its body. They could be forged into extremely powerful hunting weapons. It was completely different from the steel weapons used by other ordinary hunters. Whoosh! Dean quickly ran in the direction of the giant wall. After a moment, he returned to the giant wall. He looked up and saw that Nicholas was still on the giant wall. He was holding the edge of the giant wall and looking down. He was stealthily approaching, so the latter didn't notice him. He ran a few steps and came to about 3 kilometers away from the giant wall. He showed himself and waved his hands at Nicholas on the giant wall. Soon he attracted Nicholas's attention. If Dean died, he didn't know what kind of trouble he would face. Today, he naturally knew the significance of Dean to him. If Dean died, he wouldn't be able to gain freedom. On the contrary, if Dean died, the magistrate would investigate carefully with Dean's prominent identity. At that time, the blame would be put on his head. He was just a criminal in Thornflower Prison. If he lost Dean, he would have no background to rely on. He would be sent to prison again by the forces that Dean had a good relationship with. Dean saw that Nicholas had noticed him and immediately gestured to him. Nicotine's face slightly changed as he saw Dean's gesture. He looked down at the giant wall and felt a burst of dizziness in his mind. His face turned pale. He had been waiting here for a long time. First, he was afraid of heights. Second, he was worried that the beast would come back again when he was halfway up the wall. He would become a conspicuous bait when he was hanging in the air. He hesitated in his heart and wanted to use a gesture to ask if he wanted to take other things with him. Suddenly, he woke up and his face showed a trace of bitterness. From Dean's position, he understood that the latter was afraid of him shooting shark spears from the giant wall, so he stood thousands of meters away. But he knew that he would not do that. Sighing in his heart, he knew that there was no room for explanation, so he tightened the rope on the edge and checked it again. After confirming that there was no problem, he clenched his teeth and climbed up the giant wall. He grabbed the rope with both hands and slowly slid down. Dean quietly watched him. When he reached the height of 700 or 800 meters, he immediately rushed towards the giant wall. By this time, Nicholas had slid down to about 500 meters. He waited for a few minutes. Nicholas slid down from the rope. His old face was as white as paper. His legs were trembling as he landed on the ground. It seemed that he was scared. Dean smiled in his heart when he saw his appearance. He realized that a cunning person was no different from an ordinary person in the face of his own weakness. "You've worked hard. Go back." Dean patted his shoulder and said to him like an elder talking to a junior. He didn't consider the age gap between them. He turned around and opened the door on the ground. Nicholas was surprised for a moment. He quickly jumped into the passage. He saw Dean walking in front of him. He couldn't help but ask, "What about the beast?" "It's dead." Duddian didn't look back as he said in an understated tone. He felt helpless and depressed in his heart. He had prepared for so long, but in the end the people from the inner wall easily got the fruits. Fortunately, there were some eggs left in the nest, otherwise he would have suffered a big loss and would have made a wedding dress for others. Dead? Nicholas was stunned. He suspected that there was a problem with his ears. Dead? Such a huge and malevolent monster was killed just like that. He stared blankly at the back of the young man in front of him, a little absent-minded. After a while, he came back to his senses. He felt a burst of cold, and his body felt a little cold. The demons and goddesses on the walls on both sides of the dark passage seemed to be peeping at him with evil spirits. He hurried to catch up with Dean and cautiously asked, "Is he really dead? Is this a demon that bestows a name?" "I hope so," Dean replied. Chapter 339. After a moment, Dean and Nicotine came out of the passage. There were 2 teams of Knights of Light on both sides of the passage. There were 2 teams of Knights of Light patrolling in the distance. The 2 teams of Knights of Light were stunned when they saw Duddian and Duddian coming out of the passage. But then they were pleasantly surprised. The middle-aged knight who had talked to Dean before came over. "Architect Dean, you finally came out. We were almost scared to death." Dean was surprised and immediately thought of the reason, but still asked, "Why?" The middle-aged knight replied, "There was a commotion outside not long after you came in. It must be the giant monster that was active outside the giant wall. Fortunately, you didn't meet it at that time, or we would have suffered a big crime." Dean smiled. "We were far away at that time. I heard the commotion too. Fortunately, we were fast enough, or we would have to sneak back through the passage." "Yes." The middle-aged knight had a look of lingering fear. If Dean had died outside the giant wall, then the temple would have punished him. Even if it wasn't a heavy punishment, it would affect his career prospects. His competitors would attack him. Dean said, "It's getting late. We have to go back. I'll trouble you to arrange it." "Yes." The middle-aged knight was very polite. He waved to a young knight, sent a message. The young knight immediately took out a whistle and blew it. From time to time, a black crow would come and bring the message to the guard. While waiting, the middle-aged knight chatted with Dean. If he could climb up Dean's tree, his status in the temple would undoubtedly improve a lot. He might even be promoted again. Dean naturally didn't give up this opportunity. In the process of chatting, he learned the name of the middle-aged knight. Charlemagne was a member of the Charles family. The Charles family was a small aristocratic family that belonged to the Huashan consortium. Charlemagne should be the most promising member of the Charles family. The prosperity of the entire family was on his shoulders. Because of his identity as the captain of the temple's knights, the Charles family had gone from decline to prosperity. Although they were still in the bottom of the aristocratic circle, but they were much stronger than most of the lower-level aristocrats. Many aristocrats didn't dare to look down on Charles' family because of his identity. The number of rich businessmen coming in and out of the Charles family was dozens of times higher than before. The people from the guard have come. Let's talk later. Dean smiled at Charmin as he saw the prison carriage coming. Charmin was happy to see that Dean didn't have the slightest arrogance. The whole process of the conversation was relatively smooth for him. This was undoubtedly a good foundation for him. As long as he was careful in the future, he would be able to shorten the distance between him and Dean. If he could attend some parties with Dean, then people would know that he had some relationship with Dean. His future would be more smooth and brilliant. Well, Architect Dean, do you need me to accompany you? Charmin asked in an affectionate manner. Dean smiled as he knew that the other party was a bit impatient, but he wouldn't let the relationship between them get too close. At present, the other party would get the benefits if the relationship between them was too close. So he had to create some difficulties for the other party so that they would know how to cherish and revere each other. He said, "You have to stay here. I'm sorry if I delay your work." Charlemagne replied, "There won't be a big problem as long as they are on duty here. After all, this is a radiation zone. There are mutated beasts here. If you are disturbed, it will be a huge loss for the entire Temple of Elements and the people inside the giant wall." Dean shook his head. "It's almost nighttime. The monsters outside the giant wall will come out. It's easy to get into an accident. It's safe to have you here. The knights will protect me. Moreover, I have the hunter to accompany me. It'll be easy to deal with the mutated beasts." Nicholas was a shrewd man. He could see at a glance that Dean and the middle-aged knight were calculating. He felt that the youth was a cunning old fox. Nicholas was afraid of him. He immediately said, "Don't worry. I'll protect Architect Dean. I won't let the beasts disturb him." The middle-aged knight didn't insist anymore. He knew that the status of the middle-aged knight would drop. He said, "Architect Dean, be careful on the road." Dudian nodded and said goodbye to him. He and Nicholas got into the car and went to the Guardian's office. After a moment, the two arrived in front of the temple. Dean followed the Knights of Light into the prison cell. He said to the leader of the Knights of Light, "I'm an architect of the Temple of Elements. This is my identity token. Please help me inform the leader of the temple that Dean is here to see me." The Knight of Light was surprised when he heard the first half of Dean's words. But when he heard Dean's name, he was stunned. "Are you the architect who created the military crossbow?" Dean nodded. The leader of the Knights took Dean's medal. He saw the word Dean on it. He knew that Dean wasn't lying. He humbly said, "I didn't expect you to be Architect Dean. I didn't know you before. I'll inform you." Then he quickly turned and left. Nicholas was already used to the knight's awe. He turned his head and looked at the surrounding cages. He curiously asked, "Is this the place? I heard that hunters have to stay here for 7 days before they can go back." "Yeah." Dean nodded. "I'm bored. Take a look at the books on the table to purify your mind." Nicholas looked down and saw the Holy Scripture of Light, but he didn't take it. He curled his lips and said, "I don't know how many times I've heard the prison guards recite it. If they wanted to purify it, they would have done it long ago. The God of Light can only save people who live under the sun. How can he save people like us who live in darkness and abyss?" Dean glanced at him. "Don't add the word us. I'm not targeting you. I've already said that I'm different from garbage like you." Nicotine smiled as he heard Dean's blunt words. "You are an architect. Naturally, you're different from ordinary people like us." Dean chuckled. He didn't explain anything as he sat on the bed and waited. After a moment, the leader of the Knights pushed open the door of the underground cell. He was followed by a handsome middle-aged man. The beard on his face was very clean. His skin was incomparably white and his eyes were bright. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was a young man in his 20s. but the mature taste on his face betrayed his age. The handsome middle-aged man was followed by two knights of light. Their temperament was deep and restrained. Their eyes were sharp. "Are you Architect Dean?" The handsome middle-aged man came to the front of the cell. He was surprised to see Dean. He didn't expect that the youth who had been frequently reported in recent times would be younger than he had imagined. Dean smiled. "I am. Can we talk in private?" The middle-aged man stared at Dean for a moment. He waved his hand to signal the people around to leave. He smiled as all the Knights of Light left the cell. "Architect Dean, this is the first time we meet. What do you want to say?" Dean smiled. "In addition to admiring you, my biggest purpose is to ask you for help." "Help?" The middle-aged man's eyes lit up. "Do you want me to cover up the fact that you are out of the giant wall?" "There is nothing to cover up." Dean shook his head. "I want you to release me after the inspection and allow me to return to the city." The middle-aged man shook his head. "It's not that I don't want to help, but this matter. I'll do you a favor. How about it?" Dean interrupted him and said directly. The middle-aged man was startled. He was a member of the Holy Church, so he naturally paid more attention to the matters of the Temple of Elements. He knew about Dean's recent deeds. In fact, most of the people who weren't members of the Holy Church had heard of Dean's deeds. After all, every time a new invention came out, it would cause a great sensation, and people couldn't help but pay attention to it. The middle-aged man was in a dilemma. Favor was a big thing, but it was also a small thing. Dean saw that the middle-aged man didn't trust him. "I don't know which consortium is behind the director. I haven't sold the lightning rod that I made last time. If it is convenient for you." Chapter 340. Middle-aged man's heart was boiling, but he deliberately hesitated. "Architect Dean, this is against the law. If it is spread out." He didn't say anything as he wanted to leave some leeway. Dean narrowed his eyes. "I'm an architect of the Temple of Elements. I didn't leave the giant wall this time. I was entrusted to escort Mr. Hunter to the outside of the giant wall. After the physical examination, it was confirmed that there was nothing wrong with my body, so I should be released. Do you want to treat me like a hunter?" Middle-aged man's face slightly changed as he heard Dean's words. He thought that Dean would keep it a secret so that both of them would stand on the same boat. He didn't expect Dean's attitude to be so tough. He smiled. "Architect Dean's words are too serious. These hunters naturally can't be compared with you. I'll order people to change to a clean room for you. As for the early release, you are an architect of the temple. It would be a loss to the temple and disloyal to the Holy Church if you stay here. I'll order people to send you back after the physical examination." He paused and stared at Dean. "It would be great if you could sell your lightning rod to the Scott Consortium of the church." Dudian didn't expect that the person behind the director was from the Scott Consortium. Although he expected the 6 consortiums and Holy Church to infiltrate each other, but he didn't expect that the Scott Consortium would be able to buy the director. This was an excellent chess piece, as he was in charge of the life and death of the hunters. He was in charge of the hunters' life and death. He had high authority and great role. The Scott Consortium has such a deep foundation, but they can only fight evenly with the Mellon Consortium. These consortiums have been operating for decades, and their forces are spread all over the place. It would be too slow to cut them off one by one. I can only use force to break them." Dean's eyes lit up as he calmly looked at the director. "I have cooperated with the Scott Consortium many times. I believe that the cooperation of the lightning rod will be very pleasant. I haven't asked your name yet." "Divine Emissary Du is too polite. I am Lemvy." The middle-aged man was happy and excited. Releasing Dean ahead of schedule was a trivial matter for him. Even if Dean didn't use the lightning rod as a bargaining condition, he was willing to make friends with an architect with extraordinary potential. Moreover, he would be able to share the wealth of the Scott Consortium. Moreover, he would be able to improve his own status. It was a bargain for him. Dean nodded and wrote down the name. "Thank for the trouble." He sat back on the bed. Lemby laughed as he saw Dudian's intention. "I'll arrange someone to come over and give you a physical examination. But before that, I'll change your room. It's too dirty here." "No, the residence is just a worldly possession. Don't worry about it." Dudian calmly replied. Lemby looked at the youth with interest and said, "Since that's the case, I'll take my leave first." With that, he turned around and left the cell. Nicotine silently observed everything. He looked at Dean after Lemby left. "Master, won't you take me back with you? You will wait here for 7 days before going back." Dadian indifferently said, "My early return will arouse the attention of some forces. If we go back together, then the target will be bigger. In addition, I'll come back right after I go back. Be careful with your words and don't talk nonsense." Nicotine heard his warning. "I will. Master, I made a mistake in the past, but I will be absolutely loyal to you from now on. I hope you could trust me once again. I only look at the performance." Dadian indifferently replied. Nicotine wryly smiled but didn't say anything. After a moment, 2 doctors came in and gave Dadian a physical examination. They left after the examination. They didn't pay attention to Nicotine, who was on the other side. The next day, Dadian sat in a carriage. He was escorted by a team of Knights of Light to a nearby fortress. The reason for sending this team of Knights of Light was that the barbarians in the radiation zone had been active recently. They were worried that they would hurt Dean. If Dean fell, the sinners would naturally be counted as his head. Therefore, they had to take care of Dean carefully. At the same time, they hoped to increase Dean's goodwill. With the intelligence network of the Luminous Church, the group chose a route that had fewer savages. Along the way, they were attacked by a few mutant beasts, but they did not encounter any savages. They returned to the fort without any trouble. Dadian directly went back to his castle with the carriage of the Holy Church. The carriage moved at a fast speed. Some carriages of wealthy merchants saw the flag of the Holy Church on Dadian's carriage. They moved to the side of the road and didn't dare to block the road. A few hours later, Dadian returned to the castle. He saw Jean sitting in the hall. Where are the 2 of them? Jean was sitting cross-legged while peeling fruits. He was shocked as he saw Dadian come back. He almost cut his fingers. He stood up and said, "Young master, they are at home. Gwyneth is upstairs. Sergei is at the training ground." Dadian immediately said, "Call them over." "Yes." Jean turned and ran away. It didn't take long for Gwyneth, Sergei, and Jean to appear in the hall. Dean was drinking tea to replenish the lost water in his body. He immediately ordered, "Sergei, go and buy a batch of things to make hunting traps. Here are the gold notes." He threw a stack of gold notes on the table. Sergei was surprised. "Are you going outside the giant wall again? Didn't you just come back? Why are you talking so much nonsense?" Dadian squinted at him. Sergei went forward to pick up the gold notes and left the hall. Dadian looked at Gwyneth. "Go and buy some weapons for you and my arrows. Also buy some ropes for hauling." Gwyneth nodded and took the gold notes. She silently left the castle. Dadian looked at Jean. "Go and hire." "Forget it. Go and buy a carriage and prepare to haul things." Old Jean was slightly startled, but he still nodded in agreement. Dadian turned to Crone after the 3 left. "We will go outside the giant wall again. You will take care of the house. Cut out any news in the next 2 days and give it to me when I come back." "Yes, master." Crone nodded respectfully. After entering the castle, he learned the attitude of Gwyneth and the others. He didn't dare to overstep his boundaries. He felt a familiar and strange feeling from Dean. He grew up in the same orphanage as Dean. The distance between them seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as Dean's identity got bigger and bigger. Crone didn't dare to treat Dean casually. Moreover, Dean was talking with Sergei, Jean, and others in the castle. They specifically talked about Dean's trip to the outside of the giant wall. In the past, he had some yearning for the outside of the giant wall, but after listening to Sergei and Jean, he knew how dangerous it was to go to the outside of the giant wall. At the same time, he understood that this companion of his who grew up in the same orphanage was able to achieve the achievements he had today because of countless life and death experiences. This made him have an indescribable, complex mood. "Another cup." Dadian handed him the cup. Crone took it and immediately filled it up. Dudien's fingers gently tapped on the table as he looked at the distant view outside the castle. A few hours later, Jean was the first to come back. He drove a carriage and stopped by the Tiza River outside the castle. Duddian saw Jean jump down from the carriage. No, coachman. Chapter 341. Smart. Duddian smiled and praised. Old Jean was overjoyed and smiled humbly. I learned it from young master. I don't know how to flatter. Duddian smiled. Jin's face turned red as he scratched his head. After a moment, Sergei and Gwyneth came back with a team of carriages loaded with a lot of goods. Master, we have bought everything. This is extra money. Sergei came over and handed a stack of gold and silver bills to Duddian. Duddian nodded, but didn't take it. Crone, who was standing behind him, understood what Sergei meant. He came forward and put away the money. Get ready to load the goods. Duddian ordered. Okay. Sergei nodded and turned to the workers of the Chamber of Commerce, who came with the convoy. Mel family. Castle. Office on the first floor of the building. Sarah Mel was sitting in the spacious office. She was quietly listening to the report of a handsome youth in front of her. She nodded after he finished. He didn't leave the giant wall. Is he really ready to give up his identity as a hunter? By the way, didn't you investigate the driver of the beast carriage that transported him there? You should know something, right? The youth bowed his head. The coachman was attacked by a mutant beast on the way back. The patrolling Knights of Light were aware of it. His body was bitten by the beast. The rescue was ineffective and he died. Sarah Mel was startled. Attacked by a mutant beast? Didn't he have a Knight of Light escort him back? The youth shook his head. No. Stupid. There was a trace of anger in Sarah Mel's eyes. She suddenly thought of something. Are you sure that he was attacked by a mutant beast? It wasn't man-made? I'm sure. The youth bowed. I have sent people to check his body. There are no human scars on his body. All of them were claw marks and teeth marks of mutant beasts. Sarah's eyebrows wrinkled. Her eyes were cold. Stupid civilians. Death is not enough. Scott Consortium. Council Hall of the Consortium headquarters. Chastov looked around at the crowd. I have good news to tell you. The latest 4-star high-quality lightning rod has been sold to the Scott Consortium. In addition to sharing this good news, I also want to inform you that the consortium's funds will be transferred to the production of the lightning rod. We don't know the cost, but it won't be small. Currently, the consortium is short of funds, so we will be recruiting wealthy businessmen to join us in the production of the lightning rod. We need to make the lightning rod as soon as possible before the rainy season. We have enough goods so that we can use the lightning rod during the next rainy season to earn enough funds for the mining project. The consortium members on both sides of the long table looked at each other. Some were pleasantly surprised, some were skeptical, and some were worried. One of the middle-aged men said, Chairman, didn't Architect Do say that he would consider selling after the black snow season? Why did he suddenly agree to sell it to us? Chistov looked at him. Speaking of this, I have to thank Rosie. She went to Architect Dean's castle many times and used her excellent diplomatic skills to negotiate this matter. Everyone couldn't help but look at Rosie, who was sitting at the other end of the long table. She had a smile on her face and a calm expression. Miss Rosie is really a good negotiator. She is indeed a talented woman who has studied in a magistrate. Congratulations in front of the castle. Dean called Sergei, Gwyneth, and Jean to get on the carriage. Before leaving, Dean thought of something and looked at Crone. If the Scott Consortium comes to talk to me about the invention, then tell them to wait for me to come back, and we will discuss the details. Tell them to prepare the gifts. Crone was startled. Yes, master. Duddian nodded and sat on the head of the mammoth. He looked at Jean, who was holding the rope. Let's go. Old Jean nodded and drove the mammoth carriage to the special road for beast carriages, heading towards the fort. They arrived in front of the fortress after a few hours. Duddian showed his architect's medal and smoothly entered the radiation zone. They walked for 2 hours before they reached the giant wall passage. Gwyneth and Sergei killed many mutant beasts along the way, but didn't meet any barbarians. Dean untied the rope ladder that was wrapped around the mammoth's forehead. He climbed down the ladder and looked at Charlemagne. It's your duty today. Thank you for your hard work. Charlemagne was surprised as he looked at Duddian. He didn't expect Duddian to be so powerful. Duddian had gone to the Guardian Institute yesterday, and now he was able to bring people out again. Obviously, he had left the Guardian Institute. Charlemagne's attitude became more polite. You are too polite. We are here to serve the residents of the Giant Wall. It's what I should do. Dudian nodded and pointed to Sergei and the others. They are hunters of our consortium. They are here to build a stronghold outside the Giant Wall. These are the materials. Charlemagne glanced at Sergei and the others. It's a small matter. He turned and waved his hand to signal the Knights of Light to open the passage. Dudian waved to Sergei and the others to move the materials. Sergei, Gwyneth, and Jean put away the surprise on their faces as they turned around to move the materials. Jean was the one who was shocked the most. He was a Knight of Light, so he knew the purity and nobility of the Knights of Light. He didn't expect the captain of the Knights of Light to be so polite and respectful to Dean. He was shocked by Dean's means, but he was disappointed and lost. The captain of the Knights of Light had a higher rank than him. In his mind, when he was a Knight of Light, such a person was a noble and holy person who lived purely to serve the God of Light. He didn't expect that the captain of the Knights of Light would reveal the secular face of an official. However, he had been in the prison for a long time. He was open-minded and saw things more deeply. There was only a sense of loss, but not too much emotion. Charlemagne naturally didn't know the thoughts of the youth. He was constantly thinking about how to get closer to Dudian. He kept looking for topics to talk about. After seeing Dudian come out of the prison in just one day, he was more determined to have a good relationship with the youth. After a moment, everything was moved in. Dudian ended the conversation with Charlemagne and looked at Jean. You go back and be responsible for the support. I'll inform you to move the materials if there is a shortage. Jean was relieved. Last time he saw Scar being taken away by the monster, he was full of fear and dread of the world outside the Giant Wall. He knew that with his little strength, he would be able to live in the goddess's favor. Once the goddess forgot about him, he would fall into hell. Jean was relieved for a moment. He had seen Scar being taken away by the monster. Yes, master. Dudian looked back at Charlemagne. Mr. Cha, can you send someone to prove that he didn't come out of the Giant Wall? No problem. I'll take care of it. Charlemagne replied. Dudian nodded and entered the passage. Architect Dean, be careful, Charlemagne said in a loud voice. Chapter 342. Dudian called Sergei and Gwyneth to bring their weapons and some lighter materials. Sergei was in front of them. If they encountered monsters that Dean couldn't smell, then Sergei's steel dragon magic marks would be able to save their lives. The three of them came to a place not far from the body of Splitter. Dean gently sniffed and smelled 2 or 3 strange smells gathered around the body of Splitter. His eyes slightly moved as he made a hostile gesture to Sergei. Sergei's heart turned cold. He bent down and held his lance as he slowly moved forward. Although Sergei was sloppy in the Giant Wall, but he was a different person after he came out of the Giant Wall. He was silent and vigilant. He noticed the huge scratches on the Giant Wall and occasionally saw huge traces of destruction along the way. It made his heart tremble. He didn't know what kind of monster Dean was going to hunt. He had been hunting for so many years, but he had never seen such a terrifying monster. Dean looked down from the hole and saw that there were 3 cheetah-like monsters on the huge body of Splitter. They were nearly 2 meters tall and had ferocious fangs. The patterns on their fur were like eyeballs. They were like peacock feathers, which had a deterrent effect on the enemy. The front of their limbs were mutated with protruding bone spurs. They looked like hooked daggers attached to the claws. 100-eyed monster, level 21. Dean's eyes slightly sank as he glanced around. He noticed that there were more corpses of other monsters on the ground. There were jungle lizards, unknown pythons, and small insect-like monsters. All of them were dead. He looked at Sergei and Gwyneth. Both of their faces were full of horror. Gwyneth's cheeks were full of shock. In her impression, most of the monsters were the size of the magic claw crocodile. They were considered as high-end monsters. However, the monster in front of her was like a prehistoric monster. It was hard to imagine the scene of a human fighting against it. The most shocking thing was that the monster was dead. The weapon that was stuck in its body was the shark's spear that she had personally participated in smelting. Compared to Gwyneth's shock, Sergei was a bit confused. Although the light inside was dim, it didn't prevent him from seeing the appearance of the giant monster. He was shocked when he first saw the huge shadow, but he quickly found out that the giant monster was one of the 8 legendary monsters in the Pyramid of Monsters, Splitter. The scratches on the giant wall were obviously caused by this splitter, but it was dead. A legendary monster died here. From the faint smell of decay, Sergei could conclude that the time of death was not more than 2 days ago. 2 days ago was the day when Dean went out to hunt. The shark spear on the body was enough to prove this point. His heart was beating wildly. He turned to look at Dean, who was next to him. He was both excited and nervous. Its magic marks should not have been. Dean didn't answer him, but looked at the two of them. There are 3 monsters down there. One for each of us. Is there any problem? Sergei and Gwyneth looked at the calm and deep eyes of the teenager. They felt a burst of chill in their hearts. Their attitude towards Dean quietly changed. Sergei responded, I can barely do it. If I remove the nails on my body, then I can fight 3 monsters by myself. I'll get the nails for you when we get back, Dean said. Sergei and Gwyneth's heart jumped. They looked at each other. They could see the surprise in each other's eyes. Dean had forbidden them to pull out the nails in order to suppress them. Now he was willing to help them remove the nails. Obviously, it was not because of their loyalty, but because he wasn't afraid that they would regain their strength. Sergei understood what Dean was relying on. His heart was filled with both fear and curiosity. He had only heard about the legendary magic marks in the rumors. He had never seen it before. Was it really as terrifying as the rumors said? While the two of them were thinking, Dean had already pulled out an arrow and aimed at the nearest 100-eyed hellhound. The moment it bit a piece of flesh, he suddenly released the arrow, and with a whoosh, the sharp arrow flew out. The dog reacted very fast. When it heard the sound of the arrow, its body suddenly turned sideways and jumped to dodge, but its speed was still too slow. Dean's physique was almost the same as an ordinary senior hunter. At this moment, the distance between them was less than 200 meters. The bowstring was pulled, and the arrow's speed reached its peak. When the dog suddenly reacted, it was already a step too late. Puff! The arrow hit its ribs. The 100-eyed monster groaned and fell to the ground. It quickly stood up and glanced around despite the pain in its ribs. Dean had already shot the second arrow when it noticed him. 100-eyed hound saw Dean and the others on the hole, and the arrow flew over, enlarging in its pupils. Its body hurriedly jumped to the left to evade, narrowly escaping the arrow. Dean wrinkled his eyebrows as he saw the sensitive response of the hound. He thought of the catalytic effect of the flesh and blood of the Ripper. The speed of the hound was by no means normal. The color of its fur was red. It was almost the same as a level 25 monster. It was almost impossible for Sergei and Gwyneth to deal with it alone in their current state. I'll leave the other two to you. Sergei, you'd better cooperate with Gwyneth. You can't kill it alone, Dean said indifferently as he put the third arrow on the string. At this time, the other 200-eyed hellhounds also stopped eating when their companion was attacked. They turned their heads and rushed toward Dean and the others who were above the hole. There was a trace of arrogance on Sergei's face as he heard Dean's words. He was about to refuse, but he saw that the speed of the 2 hounds was extraordinary. He immediately retreated and pulled out his spear. He was ready for battle. Dean quickly retreated. He left the 200-eyed monsters to Gwyneth and Sergei to deal with. He retreated behind Sergei and waited for the injured one to climb up. Gwyneth shouted and waved her sword to meet the hounds. Although her joints were pierced by steel nails, her movements were still coherent and fast. She waved her sword in a circle, and Sergei used his lance to defend. Both of them attacked and defended, forcing the hounds to be unable to get close to them. It must be known that Gwyneth used to be a senior punisher. She had killed a senior hunter. She lacked experience in fighting monsters. Once she had enough experience, she could even deal with a level 30 monster. Dean narrowed his eyes as he saw that the two of them were evenly matched with the hundred-eyed monster. He waited for the injured monster to climb up and then immediately shot at it. The hundred-eyed monster didn't have enough time to react. Its claws were pierced by the arrow. It screamed in pain and almost fell down. Dean knocked an arrow and shot at the hound. Otherwise, they may not be able to kill the mutated hound after a long time. 5 or 6 minutes later, the 300-eyed monsters were beheaded and fell to the ground. Sergei and Gwyneth were exhausted. They were gasping for breath. Blood was oozing out of their bodies. If it wasn't for Dean's help, they would have died. Whoosh! Dean jumped into the hole and came in front of Splitter. He was too lazy to deal with the corpses of the 300-eyed monsters. They were nothing compared to Splitter. Come down and get ready to move, Dean said to both of them. Sergei and Gwyneth didn't rest and immediately jumped down. Chapter 343. What about you? Sergei asked. Dean indifferently said, You just need to do your own thing. I will let you know what you need to know. Sergei was speechless. He didn't ask any more questions. Dean cut the flesh and blood of Splitter and put them into a folded bag. The bag was specially prepared by him. It had 2 layers inside. One layer was plastic bag, and the other layer was cotton thread. It was a relatively advanced wilderness bag. It could cover up the smell of the bag for a long time. Dean picked up the folded bag and went out of the subway. He told Sergei to take good care of the place. Then he went into the ruins of the grass and quickly left. After 7 or 8 miles, he stopped and sniffed. He saw that Gwyneth and Sergei weren't following him, so he continued his journey. More than half an hour later, Dean came to the cave of Splitter. The cave was still sealed and maintained the previous appearance. Splitter had hunted all the nearby territories. For the time being, no monsters had come close to it. It was relatively safe. He gently moved the boulder and opened a gap. He sniffed the smell inside. He smelled the smell of a small Splitter. It was the same smell as the one he had smelled for the first time. It was the smell of a hatched Splitter. He moved the boulder according to the previous hunting method and revealed a gap. At the same time, he sensed the movement of the newborn Splitter. He saw that it was behind the boulder. He took a few steps back and threw stones to lure it out. The newborn Splitter obviously didn't learn from the 2 injured brothers in the cave. He quickly climbed to the gap and looked around. Suddenly, a cold arrow was shot at him and hit the eyeball in the core of his body. The angle of the arrow was very tricky. The newborn Splitter let out a blood-curdling screech and quickly crawled back into the cave. Dean ran over and did the same thing. 10 minutes later, the newborn Splitter fell under his arrow. Its limbs were cut off. Only the core torso was left. It was tied up in the cave. The other 2 little Splitters were tied together in the cave. The ropes on their bodies were broken. It seemed that the newborn Splitter had cut off the ropes. Its body rolled to the side of the pile of monsters. It opened its mouth to bite the food on the pile of corpses. The 2 little Splitters screamed as they saw Dean enter the cave. It seemed that they were extremely frightened. They kept twisting their bodies and moving back away from Dean. Dean gently smiled as he threw the bag on the ground. He took out the meat from the big Splitter. He cut the meat and threw it in front of the 3 little Splitters. After a moment, the 3 little Splitters relaxed their vigilance. They opened their mouth and swallowed the meat. Dean retracted his gaze and came to the nest. Looking at the remaining 4 giant eggs, there was a trace of heat in his eyes. He raised his hand and gently touched them. The eggs were cold. His heart suddenly moved. He put his ear on one of the giant eggs and listened carefully. After a moment, there was a creaking sound coming from inside the egg. It seemed that something was gently rubbing. Is it awake? Dean's eyes lit up as he gently patted the eggshell. Crack! A crack appeared on the eggshell, but it wasn't the place where Dean patted. Dean was surprised as he saw the crack. He quickly retreated a few steps and aimed an arrow. Crack! The crack on the eggshell rapidly expanded. A sharp sickle pierced out from the inside and quickly cut the giant egg. The eggshell cracked and the viscous slurry seeped out. It revealed the shape of a little Splitter. Dean's face slightly changed. He was about to let go of the arrow. but he suddenly remembered that there were other giant eggs next to him. In case the little thing was injured, it would break the other giant eggs. The loss would be too great. He immediately retreated. The little splitter squeaked as it saw Dean and ran over cheerfully. Dean quickly shot an arrow as it ran out of the nest. Puff! The arrow hit the core of the splitter's body, which hadn't fully opened yet. The splitter screamed in pain as it stopped moving. Dudian immediately shot an arrow into its mouth. The little splitter rolled on the ground in pain. Its sharp blade left deep marks on the ground. Dudian retreated back into the cave. He held the dagger in one hand as he stared at the little splitter. The little splitter climbed up from the ground and screamed as it rushed towards Dudian. Dudian didn't engage in close combat with it. He returned to the gap in the cave and picked up a boulder to throw at it. Dudian captured the little splitter after a few minutes. He cut off all its limbs and tied it up to the side. He fed it a piece of flesh from the big splitter. Dudian picked up some rotten corpses from the pile of monsters and threw them into the center of the circle surrounded by the 4 little splitters. Dudian squatted down and looked at the little splitter that had been cut off. He found that the wound had scabbed and there seemed to be a new sharp edge coming out of it. Dean suddenly thought of an idea. He secretly noted it down. When he went back, he would ask Jean to prepare some lime powder to completely destroy their wounds, so that they would completely become broken limbs, unable to grow new tissues. However, this method was cruel, but he didn't hesitate as he thought of his great cause. Dudian got up and looked at the remaining 3 giant eggs in the nest. He listened to the movements inside. He found that 2 of the giant eggs were making subtle sound from time to time. It was obvious that the little splitter had finished its gestation, but it didn't have the ability to drill out of the giant egg. It would take at most 1 day for the little splitter to break out of the shell. He poured the flesh of splitter in his bag in front of the 4 little splitters. He turned around and left the cave. After sealing the gap, he quickly returned to the subway. From afar, he saw a simple trap laid by Sergei. It was covered with grass. Although it was simple for humans, it was extremely effective for monsters. Dudian looked at the 4 or 5 bulging bags on the ground. Gwyneth and Sergei were busy cutting the flesh of the splitter and loading it into other bags. Sergei looked at Dudian. "Master, do you only need flesh and blood? What about the shells? Take out the flesh and bring back the shells." Dudian picked up the 4 bags and left. Sergei and Gwyneth watched Dudian leave. They looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Could it be that they didn't need to bring back the flesh? Where would they move to? Chapter 344. In the blink of an eye, 2 days had passed. In the past 2 days, Dean had been transporting the flesh of the great splitter during the day. At night, he had been accompanying Sergei and Gwyneth to guard the corpse of the great splitter. They had been setting traps to resist other monsters. Perhaps because of the black snow season, the decaying speed of the flesh of the great splitter was slower. Moreover, the smell of the great splitter didn't attract the attention of too many monsters. Nevertheless, the 3 of them had encountered 4 or 5 battles in 2 days. Fortunately, the monsters in the vicinity were generally around level 15 to 25. The monsters that were lured over were easily killed under the cooperation of the 3 of them. What made them pleasantly surprised was that there was a monster that had been given a name, Bloody Ripper. This was a ripper in its growth stage, a rare named monster. Its hunting rank was 18, and when it reached the peak of its maturity stage, its hunting rank would be 32. Dean, Gwyneth, and Sergei had successfully killed the Bloody Ripper. They took out the parasitic soul worm and sealed it in a jar that was always prepared by the hunters when they went out. About 7 or 8 tons of flesh had been cut out of the great splitter in 2 days. All the flesh and blood inside the sharp limbs had been peeled out to prevent the carapace of the sharp limbs from decaying. The flesh and blood had been transported to the great splitter's cave by Dean. 2 of the remaining 3 giant eggs had hatched. The little splitter had been injured by Dean as soon as it came out. Dean had used the poison inside the arrow to paralyze the little splitter. Then he had cut off the little splitter's sharp limbs so that the little splitter would lose its fighting ability and become a naked worm. The famous legendary monsters had been turned into 6 naked worms by Dean. They were fed the flesh and blood of the great splitter. The 6 little splitters would eat the flesh and blood of the great splitter when they were hungry. Their appetite had become stronger as they were injured. Each of them would eat 400 to 500 pounds of the great splitter's flesh and blood every day. The growth of the 6 little splitters was extremely obvious after they were fed the great splitter's flesh and blood. In just a few hours, they would change their appearance. The growth speed was extremely amazing. In just 2 days, they had grown from 3 meters long to 6 meters long. Dean estimated that it would take another 4 or 5 days for them to grow to 11 or 12 meters in length. At that time, they would enter the growth stage and reach the hunting level of 40. However, compared to the other level, 40 monsters, these 6 little splitters were obviously too weak. Their combat ability was greatly weakened. Moreover, with such rich nutrition, they had completely lost the experience of sharpening their blades every day. Not only did they lose their blade-like limbs for combat, but they also lost the ability to fight. Even if they regrown their blade-like limbs, they would need to slowly learn and adapt to it. Only then would they be able to gradually regain the majesty of a legendary monster. The barbarians that had gathered in the Red Maple Mountains were getting stronger and stronger. Finally, they couldn't stand it anymore. They raised their army and pressed against the Guardian Wall outside the commercial district. The barbarians that had gathered in the Red Maple Mountains were getting bigger and bigger. Finally, they couldn't stand it anymore. They raised their army and pressed against the Guardian Wall outside the commercial district. It was a majestic wall. It was first built after the humans' victory in the Battle of God. That was in the year 65 of the Giant Wall calendar. It had a history of more than 200 years. The descendants of the craftsmen who built the wall were unknown. They had either declined or risen. There was no news about them. The so-called Battle of God vision referred to the shocking battle when the barbarians invaded the border for the first time. It had been a long time, and the records of this battle were hard to find even in the libraries of famous academies. It was only recorded in some scriptures of the Holy Church. After the end of the Battle of God, the barbarians were repelled. The barbarians imitated the giant wall and built the Guardian Wall to protect the future generations. In the past 200 years, the barbarians had repeatedly invaded the border, but it was difficult for them to advance. Occasionally, they would break the fortress, but the army would quickly remedy it and drive them back. Only this time, the barbarians had learned from the previous failure. They chose a dangerous fortress which was easy to defend and difficult to attack. But after the fortress was breached, the Red Maple Mountains were a natural base. It was suitable for the military camp. The barbarians quickly occupied the Red Maple Mountains after they breached the king's fortress. The army repeatedly attacked the barbarians to no avail. They could only let the barbarians grow stronger day by day. Now, according to the newspapers of the military headquarters and the shouts of the patrolling soldiers, the entire city inside the wall was already preparing for war. Mellon Consortium. Office on the first floor of the castle. Sarah Palin looked at the 7 letters that had been sent in a short period of 2 hours. Her beautiful eyebrows slightly wrinkled as she thoughtfully touched the table. Her red eyes were like autumn maple leaves. There was a small map on the table. Sarah Palin pondered for a long time and slowly said, "Is there any movement from the Dark Church's Blaze family?" Lisa, who was dressed like a maid and had short hair, stilled for a moment. She slowly shook her head. The Blaze family has been very peaceful these days. Their businesses are doing normal business. There is nothing out of the ordinary. Miss, why do you ask? Sarah's eyes flashed. The barbarians are attacking the Guardian Wall. With a number of barbarians gathered in the Red Maple Mountains, it will be difficult for the military to resist. Once the barbarians break through the gap and rush into the commercial district, the consequences and losses are not something that the army is willing to face. If they want to defend the wall, then they must use the forbidden technique of the army. Sun Flame Magic. Sun Flame Divine Art? Lisa stilled, and her expression changed. Is it the Blaze family's flame explosion divine art? Yes, it's just a different name. Sarah whispered. The flame explosion magic of the Inferno family has repeatedly caused great damage in the commercial district. Later, they provoked the magistrate. They sent high-level disciplinary officers from the inner wall to capture them. The momentum of the flame explosion magic was suppressed. I don't know how the military got the recipe of this magic and produced it, but the destructive power of this magic is too strong, so the military didn't dare to use it at will. Now, at this critical juncture, they must use it. Lisa nodded in realization and said, in that case, the barbarians will definitely lose this battle. Sarah narrowed her eyes and said, we don't need to worry about the outcome of the battle. We can only let the barbarians attack earlier. The sooner they attack, the earlier we will be able to recover our industry. These days, the Scott Consortium took advantage of the barbarians' occupation of the Red Maple Mountains and the decrease in mineral resources. Moreover, they need a lot of weapons and metals. If we don't recover our industry, then our losses will increase. If the battle continues for a month, then even if we recover the Red Maple Mountains, it would be very difficult for us to compete with the Scott Consortium in the mineral industry. Moreover, the war would just end, and there would be a surplus of resources. Getting the Red Maple Mountains wouldn't make much sense. Lisa wondered, but miss, how can we make the barbarians attack earlier? We can't command them. Commanding is risky. Luring them is the most reliable method. Sarah gently smiled. We only need to send a few spies to expose the weaknesses of the military to them. They will naturally find a way to attack as soon as possible. Lisa was startled and couldn't help asking, will they believe it? If the news is true, then they will naturally believe it. Sarah's lips curved into a smile. Lisa was taken aback. Her eyes lit up as she lowered her head and said, Miss is wise. Chapter 345. Rhine Family. The study room on the second floor. Old Feline dismissed the maids. Only Sander was in the room. He sighed as he looked at the night sky outside. There was a bit of worry on his face. Sandro, who was serving at the side, could not help but ask when he saw his father's expression. Father, are you also worried about the barbarians' invasion? With the strength of the army, it shouldn't be difficult to defend the Guardian Wall. Even if the army fails, the Holy Church and the magistrate won't just sit back and watch. Besides, if the Guardian Wall falls, we can retreat to the edge of the inner wall and wait for reinforcements. Old Feline shook his head and sighed. Child, I'm not worried about the war of the army. It's our war. Our war? Sander was surprised. Old Feline said, war is a disaster, but it is also an opportunity. The 6 consortia are aiming at the huge profits brought by the war. Look at the mineral industry in the market. The price has soared. Unfortunately, they have earned wealth but lost their reputation. Look at the Holy Church and the magistrate. The Holy Church has built prayer platforms in the square. They will pray to God when the war starts. If there is a God, then why didn't he destroy the barbarians? I don't know how much wealth will be donated to the Holy Church by the civilians. As for the evil dark church that gathers potioneers and alchemists, it is very likely that they will push the direction of the war. All the forces are using the hands of the savages to fish for what they need. Only we won't be able to fish for any benefits in such a war. Instead, we will be targeted by other forces and will be taken advantage of by them to destroy. Sander's face slightly changed. Are you talking about the Melon Consortium? Old Feline sighed. It's hard to avoid disasters, but it's hard to refuse blessings. I hope that the Scott Consortium will draw the attention of the Melon Consortium. Otherwise, in this chaotic period of war, we will become their food. Sander was surprised. Father, aren't your words too negative and pessimistic? We have Dean behind us. The Melon Consortium has been trying to deal with us, but to no avail. The authority of the Holy Church and the Temple of Elements shouldn't be provoked. They shouldn't dare to provoke our anger at this time. Old Feline smiled. But the problem is that Dean is outside the giant wall. At this critical moment, he didn't stay in the Temple of Elements. I don't know if he deliberately exposed such a flaw to lure the Melon Consortium to attack, or if he didn't consider this point and went outside the giant wall. If it's the latter, then I'm afraid that we will suffer a big loss this time. Sandro was startled. He thought for a moment and said, "Father, since the situation is so urgent, should I immediately send someone to call him back? He is outside the giant wall. So how can we call him back? We haven't built a stronghold yet, so it's impossible for us to contact him. We can only wait for him to take the initiative to contact us." Old Feline sighed. "But he often hunts outside the giant wall for 2 or 3 days, or even 1 or 2 weeks. I'm afraid that by the time he comes back, his foundation will have been uprooted and he will become a prisoner again." Sandro was shocked. Only now did he realize the seriousness of the matter. He couldn't help but say, "Father, isn't this too exaggerated? He is an architect of the Temple of Elements. How can he become a prisoner again? Can the Melon Consortium intervene in the Temple of Elements?" Old Feline bitterly said, "Our Ryan family doesn't have many opportunities for you to gain experience. You will understand in the future. Maybe after this incident, you will understand that there are many ways to achieve your goals. But those ways are hidden too deep. Most people can't see them. Even if some people see them, they're too proud of their identity and don't want to go. You have to know that going outside the giant wall is tantamount to death." Sander was shocked. Although Old Feline didn't say it clearly, but the last sentence made him understand his father's worries. He couldn't help but ask, "Father, do we have to sit still and wait for death? I have sent someone to inform him. He will get the news when he contacts the giant wall." Old Feline sighed. "The rest is up to fate. Perhaps our Ryan family is doomed to be unable to make a comeback. But it's a pity for this boy. If we give him 5 years, then he will be at the top of the outer wall. Even Rudolph of the Bourong family and Chai of the Scott Consortium won't be able to compare with him." Sander was silent for a moment. If he can't get through this crisis, then it won't be a pity even if he dies. Old Feline looked at him, but didn't say anything. He leaned back in his chair and slowly closed his eyes. The next day, Old Feline had just finished his breakfast with the younger generation of the family. He hadn't had time to leave when he heard the butler announce that someone had arrived. He was surprised, but he sat firmly in his chair and ordered the butler to bring the person in. However, the butler didn't turn around to lead the way as the person broke the door. His voice spread to the ears of the people in the dining room. "Don't be polite. I will go back after collecting the debt." A middle-aged man came in. He was followed by 2 young knights. He was wearing an official knight medal issued by the Knights Hall. Moreover, was an intermediate silver medal. Old Feline's face slightly changed. "It's rude of you to break into the castle." The middle-aged man had an arrogant expression on his face. When he heard this, he sneered as if he had been poked at. The corners of his mouth curled into a disdainful smile as he said, "Rude? Old Feline, your family owes us 428,600 gold coins. Isn't it rude?" Old Feline was startled. Sander, Jake, and the other children on both sides of the table were stunned. They suspected that there was a problem with their ears. Old Feline's face sank. "What nonsense are you talking about? When did our Ryan family owe you money?" "Oomph." The middle-aged man sneered as he took out a sheepskin scroll. "This is the contract. It is clearly written on it. Even if you go to the magistrate, it will be the same." He threw the scroll towards Old Feline. The scroll didn't fall at Old Feline's feet. The middle-aged maid bent down to pick it up and handed it to Old Feline. Old Feline's face was gloomy as he opened the parchment. He looked at Jake. "You unfilial son, how could I give birth to such a thing? You owe me this debt." Old Feline's face was gloomy as he opened the parchment and looked at Jake. "You are an unfilial son. How could I give birth to such a thing? You owe me this debt. Go and pay it yourself." He angrily threw the sheepskin scroll at Old Feline. Jake was startled. He couldn't care less about the knife in his hand and hurriedly caught the sheepskin scroll. He hurriedly flipped it open, and his eyes widened. He stood up from his chair and cried out involuntarily, "Impossible! When did I ever sign such a contract? Impossible!" The middle-aged man seemed to be very happy to see the scene in front of him. He smiled and said, "Mr. Jake, don't you remember what you said in the Moulin Rouge in Lido last time? How could you forget it in the blink of an eye? These words were written in black and white by you. Now you want to renege on your debt?" Jake felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He rushed in front of him and roared, "You framed me. I read the contract at that time. It wasn't like this at all. You are despicable. You are committing a crime. You gave me a fake contract to sign. I will sue you." The middle-aged man touched the saliva on his face and pressed his hand on Jake's chest, pushing him 2 steps back. He tidied up his clothes and said indifferently, "Go ahead and sue. I don't need to tell you how to get to the magistrate's court, do I?" You. Jake's eyes turned red as he stared at him. Chapter 346. Jake's body trembled in anger. He turned to old Feline. "Father, I was framed by them. Please believe me. I don't have the courage to sign such a contract. The people behind them must be from the Melon Consortium." Old Feline's eyes moved away from Jake's face as he stared at the middle-aged man. "Ryan family will investigate this matter. Please give us 1 day." "All right," the middle-aged man said. "As long as you sign an agreement here, your family will pay back the money within a day, and I will agree to leave. Otherwise, the ones who should leave should be you. Although this castle is a little shabby, it is still worth some money. Take it as giving me back some of my capital." "Father," Sandro hurriedly called out. Old Feline raised his hand to stop Sandro's words. His wrinkled face revealed a bit of coldness. There was unprecedented chill in his eyes. "Don't push your luck. If I expel this bastard from the family, you won't get anything but his corpse. If you want it, then take it." Old Feline waved his sleeves. He didn't look at Jake, who was in front of him. Jake's face turned pale as he heard these words. He didn't know if he was scared or angry. He knelt down and hugged old Feline's legs. "Father, you can't do this. If you drive me out of the family, then they will definitely kill me. You can't be so cruel. You can't." "Yes, Grandpa." Below the dining table, Hughes and another young girl were at a loss as to what to do. They hurriedly knelt down and pleaded for their father. Old Feline didn't hear them. His face was cold as he stared at the middle-aged man. Middle-aged man's face slightly changed as he looked at old Feline. "Patriarch, you are really courageous. Good courage. His own son and grandson were not even worth this much money. Fine. 1 day. I will give you 1 day. If you can't get the money tomorrow, then get out of here. Otherwise, don't blame me for being impolite." He left in anger. The butler immediately followed them out of the dining room. After a moment, the butler returned and bowed to old Feline. "Master, they have left." Old Feline's face slightly trembled as he heard Dudion's words. He slowly leaned back on the chair. The murderous aura in his eyes dimmed, as if he had aged 10 years. The hall was silent. Everyone's eyes fell on him. Sandro couldn't bear it and said in a low voice, "Father." Old Feline looked at him. "Immediately contact Deacon Antia and ask her to come here." Zindral immediately replied, "Yes." He looked at Jake, who was kneeling in front of old Feline. His eyes flashed coldly, but he didn't say anything. He turned around and left. After a moment, the sound of carriage galloping echoed outside the hall. Jake's face was pale as he clutched old Feline's trousers. He pleaded, "Father, I was really framed. Please save me. I am your son. You have given everything to him since childhood. I didn't fight for anything. I know that I made a mistake this time." "But they deliberately wanted to deal with us. Old Feline looked down at him. He lifted the crutch in his hand as he wanted to hit Jake. However, he felt a pain in his chest as his hand softened. He took 2 deep breaths as he looked at Jake coldly. "Our Ryan family has been destroyed since decades ago. We have been surviving in the crevices. You didn't think about making progress. Now, at this critical moment, you have fallen into their trap. Our decades of foundation has been destroyed." Old Feline coughed again and again as he spoke. The middle-aged maid who was next to him handed him a handkerchief and a cup of tea. Old Feline took a sip of tea. He looked at Jake. "You should pray. If there is no other way, then I will expel you for the sake of the future of the Ryan family." Jake's face was as white as paper. He hugged old Feline's legs and desperately begged, Hughes and another girl also crawled over. They held old Feline's other leg and begged. Their faces were full of tears. Old Feline was indifferent as he saw Hughes and the girl begging. His eyes slightly flashed as if they were moist. At noon, Zindral returned to the castle. All the young masters and ladies of the family were sitting in hall. They looked at each other. The castle used to be noisy, but at this moment there was no noise. Zindral glanced at the butler. "We're a father and third brother. Master is in the study room on the second floor. Jake is kneeling at the door." The butler whispered. Sandro snorted coldly and quickly went upstairs. He immediately saw Jake, Hughes, and his sister kneeling in front of the study. The three of them were begging nonstop, and their throats were already hoarse. Jake hurried to look at Zindral. He saw that there was no one behind him. His face turned ugly. "Where is Deacon Andia? Why didn't she come?" Zindral was too lazy to pay attention to him. He strode over and knocked on the door. "Father, I'm back. Come in." Old Feline's voice echoed from the room. Zindral pushed the door open. Jake quickly got up and wanted to squeeze in. Zindral coldly kicked him in the chest. Jake turned around and locked the door. Old Feline looked haggard as he leaned against the bed. The middle-aged maid was gently massaging his shoulders. His face slightly changed as he asked, "Father, are you all right?" Old Feline asked, "She didn't come with you?" Sandro gritted his teeth and said, "Deacon Andia didn't want to come after hearing about this. She only asked me to pass a message to you. She said that she can't do anything even if she brings this matter to the court. Her only chance is to borrow Oracle dues, status, and financial resources to pay off the debt in one go." Old Feline's mouth slightly twitched. "What favor? It's bullshit. When our Ryan family was glorious, I had a good relationship with her teacher. Later, I assisted her in ascending to the position of the Ryan family. After so many years, our Ryan family has declined to this point. We have been wronged many times, but I have never asked her for help. Now that we are in trouble, I thought that she would help us because of our past relationship. I didn't expect that people's hearts are colder than I thought." Zindral stepped forward. "Father, don't be discouraged. There will be a solution. As she said, we can solve it once Architect Dean comes back." Old Feline snorted. "Do we need her to say such a solution? The Melon Consortium has chosen to be in a difficult situation at this time. Even if he comes back, it won't help. They have been planning this for a long time and have been waiting. Dean asked me before whether the Melon Consortium has taken action or not. At that time, we didn't realize it. But now we know that they have already taken action. The treaty has been dragged until now, and the interest has risen to an astronomical figure. How can we pay them?" Sanders' face changed. "Father, is there any reason for them to expose themselves at this time? Is it because the Scott Consortium is pressing them too hard that they are in urgent need of money? Otherwise, the interest will be higher, and we won't be able to afford it at that time." Old Feline's face turned gray. "Don't you think that the number of fees is very appropriate? It is the price of a top-grade, 4-star item. They are in a difficult situation at this time. Their purpose is to make us bankrupt and cut off Dean's path of retreat. That way they will be able to deal with Dean, who is outside the giant wall. They will frame him like the first time he was imprisoned." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.